Hey there, and welcome back. The day is behind you now, with all its small demands, and there is little left to do but set it down. Ease into the warmth, and let your thoughts grow slow and heavy. So make yourself comfortable. Let your breathing ease, and let me take you a long way back tonight, more than 5 centuries into the story of the most powerful subject England ever had, and of the two girls he raised like treasure and spent like coin. Tonight our story belongs to a man and to his girls. The man was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, whom history remembers by a single astonishing title, the Kingmaker, the man who pulled kings down and set kings up with his own hands, the richest nobleman in the kingdom, and very nearly its master. And the girls were Isabel and Anne, the two heiresses he loved and used, whom he promised, between them, to 3 different men who reached for the throne of England, and who would end their short lives as a duchess and a queen, both dead before they were 30. There is a moment we are travelling toward tonight, far off at the end of the road, when this great and terrible man lay stripped of his armour on a field swallowed in fog, and his daughters learned that everything he had built for them had come, in a single morning, to nothing. But that is for much later, when the night is deep. We have a long way to go before we reach the fog. Before we set out, one small and quiet thing. I do like to know who is keeping me company in the dark. So if the feeling takes you, leave a word below and say which part of the world you are settled in tonight, and how late the clock has run where you sit. I go through them, and there is a gentle pleasure in it. The picture of all those scattered windows, each one dark, each one tilted toward the same far-off tale as the hours wear on. And if these unhurried walks back into the deep past are something you would care to have more often, you are always welcome to subscribe, with no urgency in it at all. And another of these long evenings will be along before too much time has passed. That is all that wanted saying. From here, the night belongs to them. Picture this. A great castle on a low hill above a bend in a river, its grey walls catching the last of a winter afternoon, the smoke of 100 fires rising from within and drifting flat across the cold country. This is Warwick Castle, in the heart of England, one of the mightiest strongholds in the land, and within its walls there lives a household of such size and splendour that it is spoken of in awe across the kingdom. In the high hall, the tables are set for hundreds. In the kitchens, whole oxen turn on the spits. In the courtyards, the liveried men of the most powerful lord in England come and go on his business. And somewhere in the quiet rooms above the hall, away from the bustle below, 2 young sisters are being brought up amid more riches than almost anyone in the kingdom will ever lay eyes on, the heiresses of this enormous house. A fortune so large it is hard to put a number to it, raised in the sure knowledge that they are treasured, and in the slowly dawning knowledge that to be treasured in their world is to be useful. Their father is away more often than not about the affairs of the realm, but when he comes home to them, he comes as the most important man in England, and the whole castle turns to receive him. This is the world the 2 sisters were born into, and tonight we are going to live in it with them. From the beginning, to understand the daughters, we have first to understand the father. And to understand him, we have to go back to a world built entirely upon land and blood and the careful arranging of marriages. Richard Neville was born in the late autumn of 1428 into a family that was already among the mightiest in the north of England. The Nevilles were an ancient northern house, lords of the wild border country, and over the generations they had climbed by every means available to a great family, by service to the crown, by shrewd management of their lands, and above all, by marrying well, again and again, until their blood ran through half the nobility of England. Richard's father was the Earl of Salisbury, a powerful magnate in his own right. His grandmother was Joan Beaufort, a daughter of John of Gaunt, which gave the family a strain of royal blood. It never let anyone forget. He was born, in other words, near the very top of the English aristocracy, the heir to broad estates and a proud name, with every advantage that wealth and birth could bestow. But even this grand inheritance was only the beginning of what he would come to hold. For the truly extraordinary thing about Richard Neville's rise was that the greatest part of his fortune came to him not through his own blood at all, but through the girl he was married to as a child. The web of Neville kinship into which Warwick was born is worth pausing on, for it reached into nearly every great house in the kingdom and would shape his whole career. His grandfather, Ralph Neville, the first Earl of Westmoreland, had sired a vast family and placed them in marriage so shrewdly that Neville blood ran through a great many of the noble houses of England. One of those connections mattered above all the others. Ralph Neville's daughter Cecily, Warwick's own aunt, had married Richard, Duke of York, the man whose claim to the throne would set the whole quarrel in motion. So the Earl was first cousin to the sons of York, to the future Edward IV, and to Richard of Gloucester, the very princes whose fortunes he would later make and break, and whom his daughters would one day marry. The tie between Neville and York, fixed by his aunt's marriage and strengthened by a thick mesh of further connections, was for a long time the very backbone of the Yorkist party, the two houses climbing together toward the top of the kingdom. It was a formidable foundation for a young man's ambition. But the same web that bound the Nevilles to the Yorks could, when loyalties frayed, turn one branch of the great cousinhood against another, and in time he would make war on the very royal house his family had helped to raise. Cousin against cousin, the lattice of kinship pulled apart by the strains of power. He was born into the heart of that web, and he would die entangled in it, killed in a battle against the cousins he had crowned. For Richard Neville, like the daughters he would later marry off so coldly, was himself a piece on the board from his earliest years. While he was still a small boy, his marriage was arranged, as the marriages of all such children were, for the good of his family, and the bride chosen for him was a girl named Anne Beauchamp. The match was made when he was around 8 years old, a contract signed between two great families with no more thought for the feelings of the children than for the feelings of the furniture. Anne Beauchamp was the daughter of the Earl of Warwick, one of the foremost noblemen of the age, and though at the time of the betrothal she was not the chief heiress of her house, she carried within her the possibility of a vast inheritance should certain other lives fall away. No one could have predicted how completely that possibility would be realized. But the marriage was made, the two children were bound together, and Richard Neville was set, all unknowing, on the path that would carry him to a greatness beyond anything his own Neville blood could have given him. There is a bitter symmetry in his story, for the man who would spend his girls so ruthlessly as marriage pieces had himself been a marriage piece, married as a child for the inheritance his bride might bring, exactly as he would one day marry his own girls for the alliances they could bring him. The buying and selling of children's marriages, which governed so much of this story, was simply how the great families of the age conducted their most important business, and it is worth understanding clearly. When a wealthy heir or heiress was left a minor, the right to arrange that child's marriage and to control the lands until the child came of age became a valuable property in itself, something the crown could keep or grant or sell. To hold the marriage of a rich young heir was to hold the key to a fortune, for the heir might be married to a child of one's own, and so the whole inheritance pulled into the family. This was the machinery by which great accumulations of land were assembled and great houses raised, and the feelings of the children passed from hand to hand counted for precisely nothing in it. A child was an asset, a means of binding land to land and blood to blood, and the arranging of a profitable marriage was among the chief duties and chief opportunities of a noble parent. Richard Neville had himself been such an asset, married as a boy for the inheritance his bride might bring, and he would treat his own daughters in exactly the same way as assets to be deployed, their marriages arranged for the advantage they could bring him, their wishes never entering into the reckoning. There was nothing unusual or thought cruel in this. It was simply the way the world worked for children of their rank. But it meant that Isabel and Anne were, from birth, not quite free persons in the way we would understand the term. They were carriers of value, and their lives would be arranged accordingly by a father who had been arranged in his turn. The girl who brought him all of this deserves to be known in her own right, for she was no mere cipher through whom land passed, but a woman of real character who would outlast nearly everyone in this story. Anne Beauchamp was the daughter of an earlier Earl of Warwick, one of the most distinguished noblemen of his generation, and through her mother she carried the blood of the Despensers and a descent from the old royal line besides. She has been described by those who have studied her as intelligent, resilient, and diplomatic, qualities she would need in full measure, for her long life would carry her through triumph and catastrophe alike. As a young wife, she presided over one of the grandest establishments in England, the partner of a husband whose power grew year by year, and she bore him the two girls on whom this story turns. She would see her husband become the mightiest subject in the land, and then die a traitor's death on a foggy field. She would see her inheritance stolen from her by her own sons-in-law while she lived. She would see both her daughters married to king's brothers and both dead before 30, and she would survive all of it, outliving her husband, her daughters, and most of her enemies, to die at last an old woman, decades after the storms had passed. If the Kingmaker is the engine of this story, Anne Beauchamp is its quiet thread of continuity, the woman whose blood began it and who remained when all the rest were gone. We will return to her at the end, for her survival is one of the strangest parts of the whole tale. And then the inheritance came, through a chain of deaths so convenient that it might have been designed. Anne Beauchamp had a brother, and that brother had a small daughter, and between them they stood ahead of Anne in the line of that great inheritance. But the brother died young, and then, a few years later, his little daughter died too. A child of 5, and with those two deaths, the vast Warwick inheritance, the estates, and the title and the riches of one of the grandest houses in England, fell suddenly upon Anne Beauchamp, and through her, upon her husband. Richard Neville, who had been merely the heir to Salisbury, found himself transformed almost overnight into the Earl of Warwick himself, master of one of the richest hoards of land and treasure anywhere in the kingdom. He held the title, as men of the age put it, in right of his wife. That is, the inheritance was truly hers, by her own blood, and he held it only because he was married to her. It was Anne's fortune that made him an earl. It was Anne's blood that gave the title meaning. This is a fact worth holding on to as the story goes on, because it sits at the very heart of everything that follows. The fortune that made the Kingmaker, the riches he would fight and scheme and finally die for, the lands he would marry his daughters to secure, all of it came, in the first place, through a woman, and would in the end be fought over, after his death, as the inheritance of the women he left behind. The riches that came to Warwick through his marriage was on a scale that is genuinely difficult to imagine, and he used it to make himself something close to a power in his own right, a subject so mighty that he rivaled the crown itself. His lands sprawled across England and Wales, from the northern border country of his Neville forebears to the rich Midlands estates of the Warwick inheritance, and the income they yielded made him perhaps the wealthiest man in the kingdom who did not wear a crown. He kept a household of staggering size, thousands of men wearing his livery and eating at his expense, an affinity so large that it amounted almost to a private army. He kept lavish establishments in London and across his territories, dispensing a hospitality so lavish that it became legendary. There is a story, often told, that any Londoner who had even a passing acquaintance with one of Warwick's servants might walk into his kitchens and carry away as much meat as he could spear on a long dagger, a small detail, perhaps embroidered in the telling, but one that captures the thing exactly. The deliberate, calculated generosity of a man who understood that popularity was a kind of power and who spent his vast wealth on building it. He made himself loved by the common people and feared by the mighty, and behind both the love and the fear lay the same colossal fortune, the Beauchamp inheritance that his wife had brought him, turned now into the engine of his ambition. It is worth trying to grasp just how rich Warwick was, for the numbers, so far as they can be reckoned, are staggering. Through the combined inheritances that came to him, the Neville lands of his father, the vast Beauchamp estates of his wife, the Despencer holdings, the Montague lands of his mother's family, he controlled a sweep of territory and an annual income that placed him far above any other nobleman in the kingdom and not so very far below the crown itself. His estates were scattered across England and into Wales, a patchwork of lordships and manors and castles, so extensive that a man might ride for days and never leave the Earl land. The income from all of this ran to many thousands of pounds a year, an almost unimaginable sum in an age when a prosperous knight might live comfortably on a tiny fraction of it. And wealth on that scale was not merely money, it was power in its most direct form, for it bought men, bought loyalty, bought the armed followers and the influence, and the capacity to make war that turned a rich man into a mighty one. Warwick's fortune was the foundation of everything he became, the engine of his king-making, the source of the armies he raised and the popularity he bought, and the independence that let him defy a king. And almost all of it had come to him through marriage, through the heiress he had been wedded to as a boy, which is why, when he in turn came to dispose of his own girls, he understood so exactly what they were worth, and spent them accordingly. It was the sea, though, that made Warwick something more than merely the richest nobleman in England, for he held the high office of Captain of Calais, and there, across the narrow water, he built the foundation of his real power. Calais was England's last foothold on the continent, a fortified town and harbour that was also the base of a permanent garrison, the closest thing the kingdom had to a standing army. As its captain, the Earl commanded that garrison, and he made himself master of the Channel besides, fitting out ships and falling upon the vessels of other nations in a manner that hovered somewhere between privateering and outright piracy. He won naval victories that thrilled the English public, brought captured Spanish and Genoese ships into Calais as prizes, and built for himself a reputation as a bold and successful commander at a time when England had little enough to be proud of. The plunder enriched him further. The victories made him a hero, and the garrison gave him a body of loyal, professional fighting men entirely under his own command, independent of the crown. Few subjects in English history have ever commanded such a combination of wealth, popularity, and armed force, and he understood exactly what he held. He had made himself, through his wife's inheritance and his own ruthless ability, into a power that no king could safely ignore, and into a man who was beginning to believe that he might shape the very succession of the crown itself. The visible sign of Warwick's power was everywhere about him, in the badge his men wore and the crowds of retainers who followed him, and it is worth picturing the machinery of magnate greatness as his contemporaries saw it. A lord of Warwick's rank maintained what was called an affinity, a great body of retainers, servants, tenants, and lesser gentlemen who wore his livery, took his wages or his protection, and answered his summons in peace and war. Warwick's affinity was the largest in the kingdom, 1,000 strong, and his badge, the bear and the ragged staff, was known and feared the length of England. When he travelled with a small army of liveried men. When he came to London or to Parliament, the city filled with his followers. When he needed soldiers, he could raise them from among his own people without ever troubling the crown. This was the system that historians sometimes call bastard feudalism, the binding of men to a lord, not by the old ties of landholding, but by wages, livery, and the promise of good lordship, and no one practiced it on a grander scale than Warwick. It made him something close to a prince, a man with his own following, his own power base, his own capacity to make war. It also made him dangerous, for an affinity that large, loyal to a man rather than to the crown, was a standing threat to any king who could not command its master. Warwick's livery was a uniform worn by an army that belonged to him alone, and everyone, including the king he had made, understood exactly what that meant. And shape it he did, for the title by which history knows him was earned in the bloodiest manner imaginable, on the battlefields of a country tearing itself apart. England in the middle of the 15th century was sliding into the long dynastic war that we now know as the Wars of the Roses, a quarrel between two rival lines sprung from the same royal stock. On the throne sat the House of Lancaster, in the person of the feeble and sometimes mad King Henry VI. Against it pressed the House of York, which held that the crown was rightfully its own. The Earl threw the whole of his vast power behind the Yorkist cause, and it was largely his wealth, his armies, and his ability that carried that cause to victory. He fought in the pitched battles that broke the Lancastrian power. He played a decisive part at the terrible field of Towton, fought in a snowstorm, and reckoned the bloodiest day in all of English history, and when the dust settled, it was a young Yorkist prince who sat upon the throne of England as King Edward IV. Edward was tall, handsome, charming, and a fine soldier, and he would prove no man's puppet in the end. But in the beginning, everyone understood how he had come to his crown. He had been made king by his cousin, the Earl, by Warwick's money, Warwick's men, and Warwick's relentless will. The Earl had reached up and placed the crown of England upon a young man's head with his own hands, and from that act came the name that would follow him through all the centuries, the Kingmaker. He had made a king. He would soon discover that a monarch one has made does not always stay grateful, and that the hand which raises a crown may find to its fury that it cannot command the head beneath it. Warwick's career in arms had begun, in fact, some years before the crown changed hands, in the streets of a town called St. Albans, in a short and bloody street fight usually counted as the opening battle of the wars. The bitter feud between York and the court party had at last erupted into open violence, and the Yorkist lords, Warwick among them, fell upon the king's forces in the narrow streets of the town. It was Warwick, by the accounts that survive, who broke the deadlock, leading his men through the back lanes and gardens to fall upon the royal troops from an unexpected quarter. The fighting was brief but deadly, and several of the great lords of the court party were killed in it, men whose sons would nurse the feud for a generation. For the Earl it was a beginning, the first proof of the boldness and the readiness for violence that would mark his whole career, and the first taste of what it meant to settle the kingdom's quarrels with the sword. The wars had drawn their first blood, and the young Earl of Warwick had been at the heart of the drawing of it. From that day, his name was bound to the Yorkist cause, and to the resort to arms, and the road that led, in the end, to a foggy field at Barnet had been opened in the streets of St. Albans, with the Earl leading the charge. Seen from inside, this was not the tidy march of named battles that schoolbooks would later lay out, but something far more disorienting. A drawn-out spell of dread, broken by spasms of bloodshed, with stretches of brittle calm between in which no one could be sure how long the quiet would hold. A house at the height of favour could find itself attainted and scattered within a single year. Lords swapped sides as the advantage swung, and even a crushing wind settled nothing for long, since the losing side regrouped and came again. Crucially, the armies that did the fighting were not the king's national levies, but the private followings of the great lords. So the violence tracked the fault lines of family and faction, pitting kinsman against kinsman, and unpicking the marriages and friendships that were supposed to hold the ruling class together. A girl raised in such a house learned early that nothing held firm, that the father who ruled the realm in spring might be running for the coast by autumn, that a husband might be exalted or killed, depending on which way a single morning's fighting broke. Isabel and Anne knew no other condition. The violent lurches of their lives, from England's wealthiest heiresses to a traitor's daughters, from foreign exile to a crown, were nothing more than the wars playing themselves out through two women who had been roped to their father's cause without ever being asked. Calais itself deserves a closer look, for it was the foundation of Warwick's independent power, and unlike anything else in the English world. It was the last remnant of England's once vast holdings in France, a fortified town and harbour clinging to the French coast, held by an English garrison and bound to England by the great trade in wool that passed through it. Calais was the staple, the official channel through which English wool was sold to the looms of Flanders, and the customs and the commerce made it rich. More importantly, it was a fortress that required a permanent professional garrison, paid soldiers kept under arms year-round, the closest thing the English crown possessed to a standing army, at a time when kings otherwise had to raise their forces afresh for each campaign. As captain of Calais, Warwick commanded those professional soldiers, and they were loyal to him, their captain and paymaster, rather than to the distant king. He made the town his own power base, a stronghold beyond the sea, where he could not easily be touched, garrisoned by men who would follow him. It was to Calais that he carried Isabel to marry her to Clarence in defiance of the king. It was from Calais that he launched his rebellions. It was the secure foundation from which the whole edifice of his greatness rose. Without Calais and its garrison, the Earl would have been merely the richest nobleman in England. With it, he was a power that could challenge the crown itself, a subject with his own fortress, his own army, and his own door onto the continent, beyond the reach of any king who wished to bring him to heel. Life in Calais under Warwick had a particular character, and it is worth a moment to picture the place. It was an English town set down on foreign soil, a walled enclave ringed by hostile country, its streets full of the traffic of merchants and the clatter of the garrison, a little piece of England clinging to the edge of France. There was a rough, frontier quality to it, a town always half at war, its people accustomed to the sight of soldiers and ships and the nearness of the enemy. And over it all presided the captain, Warwick himself, lord of this small English world beyond the sea, the most powerful man within its walls by an enormous margin. The men of his garrison were hardened professionals, soldiers who lived by the trade of arms rather than farmers, called from their fields for a season's campaign. And they had the loyalty of men to the captain, who paid them and led them and shared their dangers. To them, he was not a distant magnate, but a present commander, the man at the head of their world, and they would follow him where his great tenants in England might hesitate. It was this that made Calais so much more than a possession. It was a community of fighting men bound to Warwick personally, a loyal soldiery beyond the reach of the crown. When the Earl walked the walls of his town and looked out over the harbour and the grey channel beyond, he looked out as the master of the one place in the world that was wholly his, garrisoned by men who were his own. From behind those walls he launched his defiance of kings, and from behind those walls in time he carried his elder daughter to her wedding, beyond the reach of a king who had forbidden it. There is a puzzle at the heart of Warwick's character that is worth dwelling on, for he was a man of striking contradictions. He was, on the one hand, a figure of immense charm and popularity, beloved by the common people of England as few noblemen ever have been, a generous host and a dashing naval commander, and a champion of the popular cause against a grasping court. The crowds cheered him, the city of London opened its gates to him, men flocked to his banner, and yet he was also a man of cold and ruthless ambition, who would betray a king he had made, ally with the enemy he had spent his life destroying, and spend his own daughters as pieces in a game for power, with never a sign that their feelings weighed with him at all. The same man who won the love of the multitude could kneel before Margaret of Anjou and trade his 14-year-old daughter for an army. How do these two Warwicks fit together? Perhaps they do not. Quite. Perhaps he was simply a man large enough to contain both the generosity and the ruthlessness, the popular champion and the cold schemer, without ever reconciling them. Or perhaps the popularity was itself a tool, the calculated generosity of a man who understood that the love of the people was a kind of power, and spent his wealth to buy it as deliberately as he spent his girls to buy alliances. Either way, the contradiction is genuine, and it makes him a more interesting figure than either a hero or a villain. He was both at once, the beloved kingmaker and the cold father, the people's champion and the ruthless schemer, and the two were bound together in a single, formidable, and finally tragic man. Warwick understood, better than almost anyone of his age, that power was partly a matter of image, and he tended his reputation with a care that we would now call propaganda. His manifestos, his open kitchens, his naval exploits trumpeted through the towns. His careful courting of the London crowd, all of it was, in part, the deliberate cultivation of a public character, the building of a legend that made men want to follow him. He presented himself as the people's friend, the reformer, the bluff and generous champion of the common good against a corrupt and grasping court, and the presentation was so successful that it has coloured his memory ever since. Yet it was, at least in part, a construction, the carefully managed face of a man whose real aims were power and the advancement of his house. This is not to say the popularity was false. The crowds who cheered him were real, and the good lordship he dispensed was solid enough to those who benefited from it. But it was also a tool, consciously wielded, and he was among the first English noblemen to grasp how much could be achieved by the management of one's public image, how a reputation carefully built could be worth armies. In an age before newspapers, the Earl made the towns and the taverns ring with his name. He turned himself into a figure of legend in his own lifetime, and the legend served his ambition as faithfully as his wealth and his soldiers did. It is one more mark of his formidable ability, and one more reason to be cautious in judging him, for much of what we know of him comes filtered through the image he so carefully built. The badge that Warwick's men wore, the bear and the ragged staff, became one of the most famous emblems in English history and deserves a mention, for it outlived the man and the family by centuries. The device was ancient, inherited from the earlier Earls of Warwick, whose title and lands had come to Richard Neville through his wife, and it showed a bear chained to a rough wooden staff. Under the Kingmaker, it became the symbol of the mightiest subject in the kingdom, worn by thousands of liveried men, painted on banners and carved on stone, a sign that commanded recognition and fear the length of England. Long after the Kingmaker was dead and his family destroyed, the bear and ragged staff endured, taken up by later holders of the Warwick title and woven into the heraldry and the folklore of the English Midlands, where it can still be seen today. There is something fitting in the survival of the badge, for it is, in a sense, all that endured of the Kingmaker's greatness. Not a dynasty, not a line of heirs to carry him on, but an emblem, a heraldic device that outlasted the family it had served. Warwick had reached for an immortality of blood and power, for a great house that would carry him down the ages. What he actually left behind was a badge, a bear chained to a staff, surviving in the heraldry of a county, while the family that bore it crumbled into dust. It is a strange and rather melancholy legacy for so mighty a man that what outlasted him was not his blood or his power, but a picture of a chained bear, the sign of a greatness that did not endure. When everything is added up, it is worth asking what, if anything, the Kingmaker truly left behind, and the answer is strangely little for so mighty a man. He left no son to carry the name onward. His girls died young, and their lines either failed or led to the scaffold. His vast inheritance was scattered and absorbed into other families. The kings he made were dead and their house destroyed. He had been in his lifetime perhaps the most powerful subject England ever produced, a man who genuinely held the crown in his gift, who commanded armies and fleets and the love of the people and the fate of the kingdom. and within a generation of his death, almost none of all that power remained. His name survived chiefly as a byword, the Kingmaker, a title that captured his greatness and his presumption both. His badge survived in the heraldry of a county. His story survived as a cautionary tale of overreaching ambition. But of the things he had actually striven for, the dynasty, the line of descendants bearing his blood and his name, the permanent greatness of his house, none of it survived at all. It is a sobering reflection on the nature of worldly power, that a man could hold so much of it and leave so little behind. That the mightiest subject in England could pour out his whole life and his daughters' lives in pursuit of a lasting greatness, and achieve, in the end, only his own destruction and theirs. The Kingmaker made kings and unmade them and ruled the realm. And when he was gone, it was as though a great wave had risen and towered and crashed and drawn back, leaving the beach as smooth and empty as before. That perhaps is the final lesson of his story, and the saddest, that all his enormous power, spent so freely and so boldly, came in the end to nothing that lasted, only a name, a badge, and a warning. While their father was making and unmaking the fortunes of the kingdom, the two little girls were growing up in the heart of all that wealth, in a childhood of extraordinary privilege and almost certain loneliness. Isabel the elder had been born at Warwick Castle in the autumn of 1451. Anne the younger followed nearly 5 years later in the early summer of 1456. They were the only surviving children of the marriage, for their parents had no son who lived, and this, more than anything, shaped the whole course of their lives. Because there was no boy to inherit, the vast Warwick and Beauchamp fortune would pass, in time, to the two girls, who were therefore the richest heiresses in all of England, the prizes that every ambitious man in the kingdom must have looked upon with longing. From their earliest years, the sisters would have understood that they were precious in a particular and unsettling way. Not merely loved as daughters, but valued as carriers of an inheritance, the keys to a fortune that men would scheme and fight to possess. They were raised chiefly at Castle and at the great northern stronghold of Middleham, in Yorkshire, amid every comfort and luxury their father's wealth could provide, schooled in the accomplishments expected of noblewomen of the highest rank, surrounded by servants and tutors, and the ceaseless coming and going of a household at the centre of national affairs. It was a glittering childhood. It was also, one suspects, a childhood lived under a quiet shadow, the knowledge growing in the two girls as they grew that their futures were not their own. That somewhere their father was already turning over in his mind the question of which men they would be given to and what those gifts might buy him. It is worth wondering what the two girls actually saw of all this, what their father was to them in the ordinary texture of their days. For all his greatness, Warwick was, to Isabel and Anne, simply their father, a figure who came and went, who was away for long stretches about the business of the realm, and then returned in a blaze of consequence, the whole household reordering itself to receive him. They would have seen him as children, see a great and busy parent, at a certain distance, surrounded by importance, glimpsed amid the comings and goings of his vast affairs, rather than known in the intimate daily way of an ordinary family. What he was like with them, whether he was tender or cold, whether he had time for his daughters amid the making and unmaking of kings, we cannot know, for the records say nothing of it. Yet one can easily picture how a man so consumed by ambition, so constantly about the great affairs of the kingdom, was a somewhat remote figure to his girls, loved and admired from a distance, more a presence than a companion. And it is a strange thing to grow up as the daughter of a legend, to know that your father is the most powerful man in England, that kings rise and fall at his word, that the whole kingdom turns on his decisions. It must have given the two sisters a peculiar sense of their own consequence, and a peculiar awareness, too, of how much depended on a father they perhaps did not see as often or know as well as they might have wished. He was making history, they were growing up in the shadow of it, and the history he made would in the end reach down and shape every day of their short lives. We should be careful, though, not to paint Warwick simply as a cold monster who used his girls without feeling, for the truth is almost certainly more complicated and more human. It was the universal practice of his age to marry children for advantage. A father who did not arrange the most advantageous matches he could for his daughters would have been thought to have failed in his duty, not to have spared them. Warwick, in marrying Isabel and Anne to royal princes, was doing exactly what every great father did, only on a grander scale, because his daughters were grander prizes and his ambitions were grander too. It is entirely possible that he loved his girls and believed in marrying them so high that he was securing for them the most brilliant futures imaginable queenship, the summit of the world. By the standards of his own time, he was not abusing his daughters, but advancing them, giving them the greatest marriages his enormous power could buy. That those marriages brought them grief and early death was not perhaps something he intended or foresaw. It was the working out of his failures and the cruelty of fortune, not necessarily of any coldness in his heart. We simply do not know what Warwick felt for his daughters, whether he was tender or indifferent, whether he grieved Isabel's lost baby or thought only of his own ruined plans. The records are silent, but it is fairer, and probably truer, to see him not as a man who callously used children he did not care for, but as a man of his age who pursued for his girls the highest fortunes he could imagine, and whose pursuit, through no simple fault of feeling, helped to destroy them. The tragedy is the greater if he loved them, for then he destroyed, with the best of intentions, the very children he was trying to exalt. It is illuminating to set Warwick beside the other great parents of his age, for he was far from alone in spending his children on the board of power, and the comparison softens a little the harshness of his particular case. Margaret of Anjou, as we have seen, wagered her only son in exactly the same way, marrying the boy to Warwick's daughter to serve her cause and sending him to the death that found him at Tewkesbury. Edward IV would marry his own daughters and sons into the great game of dynastic alliance. Cecily, Duchess of York, the king's mother, had seen her children deployed across the board of the wars. The truth is that this was simply how the great families of the age operated. Children were the currency of dynastic advancement, and a parent who did not spend them wisely was thought to have failed them. Warwick was more spectacular than most, only because his children were greater prizes and his designs grander, because he had the wealth and the power to aim at the very highest marriages and the boldness to wager everything on them. In the cold accounting of his world, he was a good father, one who sought for his girls the most brilliant futures imaginable and very nearly achieved them. That the futures turned to ash was the work of fortune and of his own overreaching, not of any unusual coldness in his treatment of his girls. He was a man of his time, doing what the men of his time did, only on a grander and more dangerous scale. And if his daughters paid a terrible price for his ambition, they paid it as countless other noble children paid for the ambitions of their parents, in an age that regarded children as instruments of family advancement first, and as persons very much second. The victory that set Edward on the throne was sealed in the most terrible battle of the whole long war, and Warwick was in the thick of it. It was fought near a village called Towton, in Yorkshire, on a freezing day in late March, in the teeth of a driving snowstorm, and it was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Tens of thousands fought on each side. Many thousands died. The snow ran red, and the rivers filled with bodies as the Lancastrian ranks gave way at last, and were cut to pieces as they ran. It was a ruin so total for the House of Lancaster that it left the New Yorkist king for a time beyond all challenge. The Earl had played his part in that grim triumph, as he had in the manoeuvring and fighting that led up to it, and the throne that Edward took was bought with the blood spilled at Towton. For a man like Warwick, the scale of the slaughter would have been not a horror, but a vindication, the price worth paying for the crown it purchased. He had helped to win the bloodiest day in the history of England, and the reward was a king of his own making. It was the high tide of the partnership between Warwick and the young Edward, the moment when the Earl's power and the king's gratitude ran together. That the gratitude would curdle and the partnership shatter was still some years off. For now, on the blood-stained snow of Towton, the Kingmaker had made his king, and the two of them stood victorious together. The price of all this was paid chiefly by the highborn, and that fact frames everything that befell Warwick's family. Unlike many wars, this one largely spared the ordinary villager and townsman. The killing was concentrated among the lords and their armed retinues, and between the eruptions, the common round of harvest and market carried on much as before. But for the titled families the reckoning was savage, because it was precisely the lords and their heirs who rode out and fell. And over the span of the conflict, a remarkable share of the peerage was cut down in the field or beheaded afterward. Ancient lines pruned back or ended outright. Warwick would fall in battle, his brother likewise. One daughter's husband would die on the field, and the others on a scaffold. What happened to his kin was simply one strand of a wider unravelling, in which the noble houses tore at one another for 3 decades until the battered remnant submitted, at last, to a firmer crown that would bring them to heel. Among all the casualties of that long unravelling, few families were undone so thoroughly as Warwick's lifted to the very top and then dismantled piece by piece, down the generations, until little survived but a handful of descendants who carried in their veins the perilous blood that would in the end prove the death of them as well. For their father by this time had begun to quarrel bitterly with the king. His own hands had crowned, and the two girls would soon find themselves drawn into the heart of that quarrel. The trouble between Warwick and King Edward had been building for years, fed by the king's growing determination to be his own master rather than his cousin's grateful creature. The Earl had imagined, perhaps, that having made Edward king, he would rule the kingdom through him, the power behind a young and pliable throne. But Edward had no intention of being ruled. He was a man of strong will and large appetites. And as he grew into his kingship, he increasingly went his own way, taking his own counsel, favouring men who were not Warwick's men, and pursuing a foreign policy directly opposed to the one his great cousin urged upon him. The breaking point when it came was a marriage not one of Warwick's daughters, but the king's own. For while he was abroad, labouring to arrange a grand foreign match for Edward that would have crowned the Earl's own diplomacy, the king had married in secret and on impulse a widow of modest English stock, Elizabeth Woodville by name, for no better reason than that he wanted her. When the secret came out, it was a catastrophe for Warwick's pride and his policy alike. The marriage he had been negotiating was ruined. He had been left looking ridiculous before every court in Europe, and worse was to follow, for the new queen had a host of ambitious kinfolk, and Edward set about raising these Woodvilles high safa, finding them grand spouses, granting them titles and posts, until they formed a rival faction at court that crowded the Earl steadily out toward the edges. The northern world in which the two girls spent much of their childhood was centred on a castle called Middleham in the Dales of Yorkshire, and it is worth picturing, for it was a place that shaped more lives than theirs. Middleham was one of the great Neville strongholds, a powerful castle set among the high moors and green valleys of the north, far from the softness of the south. And it was here, as much as at Warwick, that Isabel and Anne grew up. The household at Middleham was a school as well as a home, for it was the custom of the age for noble families to send their sons to be raised in the households of great lords, learning the arts of war and courtesy and lordship in another man's hall. And so it was that a boy named Richard, the youngest brother of King Edward, came to spend part of his upbringing at Middleham in Warwick's household, sharing the halls and the training and the daily life of the castle with the Earl's 2 daughters. There is a strange foreshadowing in it that Richard of Gloucester, who would one day marry Anne Neville and become King Richard III, first knew her as a child in her father's northern castle. The two of them growing up under the same roof long before politics and inheritance threw them together. Middleham was a world of horses and hunting, and the hard northern weather, of training in arms and the management of a great estate, and the children raised there took in the values of that world: loyalty, lordship, a readiness for war. For Isabel and Anne, it was home, the place of their childhood, and for one of them, it would be home again in the brief years of contentment before the final catastrophe. There is a thread of melancholy continuity running through the story of Middleham, the castle at the heart of so many of these lives, and it is worth following. It was a Neville stronghold, the place where Isabel and Anne spent much of their childhood, and where the young Richard of Gloucester came to be raised in Warwick's household. It was the place, in other words, where Anne and Richard first knew each other as children, long before fate and inheritance made them husband and wife. And it was to Middleham that Anne returned, years later, as Duchess of Gloucester, to keep her household and raise her son in the very halls where she herself had grown up. A homecoming of sorts. The one settled and contented chapter of her hard life lived out in the castle of her childhood, and it was at Middleham, in the end, that her only son was born and raised, and where, by some accounts, the boy died, the heir to the throne snuffed out in the northern castle that had sheltered 3 generations of the family. The same walls saw Anne as a child, Anne as a young wife, and Anne as a grieving mother. They saw the Kingmaker's girls at play and the Kingmaker's grandson die. There is something poignant in the way the one place returns, again and again through the story. The still point around which these restless and tragic lives revolved. Middleham was the family's true home, the northern heart of all their wandering, and it gathered up, within its grey walls, the whole arc of their fortunes. The bright childhood, the brief contentment, and the final sorrow. Of all the castles in this story, it is the one most steeped in the family's joys and griefs, the place to which they kept returning, and the place where so much of what mattered to them began and ended. It is hard to overstate how deeply the Woodville marriage wounded Warwick, or how completely it poisoned the bond between the king and the man who had made him. To a magnate of Warwick's colossal pride, the injury was intolerable on every level. His diplomacy had been overturned without consultation. The king he had raised had defied him on the most important matter of state. And the honours and marriages that Warwick had assumed would flow to his own family were going instead to the upstart relatives of a lowborn queen. Above all, there was the matter of his daughters. The Earl had 2 unmarried heiresses of the highest rank, the greatest marriage prizes in the kingdom, and the natural husbands for them were the king's own brothers, the young Dukes George of Clarence and Richard of Gloucester. Such matches would have bound Warwick's blood to the royal house and secured his family's greatness for generations. But Edward, wary now of his overmighty cousin, refused to permit them, blocking the marriages that he most desired and reserving his brothers for alliances of his own choosing. To Warwick, this was the final insult. The king he had made would not even allow him the marriages that were his daughter's due, would not let the Kingmaker's girls take their rightful place beside the throne. And so the Earl resolved to take by force and treason what Edward would not grant him freely, and his daughters, the precious heiresses of Warwick and Middleham, would be the instruments by which he did it. Beneath the particular insult of the Woodville marriage lay a deeper and more structural problem, one that made the collision between Warwick and Edward almost inevitable. The trouble was that a crowned monarch and an overmighty subject could not, in the end, easily share a kingdom. The Earl had made Edward, and having made him, expected to guide him, to stand as the real authority behind the crown, that a chief counsellor whose word the grateful young monarch would naturally heed. But a monarch who is truly master cannot be ruled by a subject, however mighty, without ceasing to be a king at all. As Edward grew into his crown, he came to resent the very dependence that had put him there, to chafe against the assumption that he owed his every decision to his cousin. He wanted to rule in his own right, to choose his own friends and his own policies, to reign in truth and not as a puppet. And Warwick, for his part, could not accept being set aside, could not bear to see the kingdom he had won slipping out of his control, could not endure the rise of rivals who owed him nothing. The two men were on a collision course, not merely because of this or that particular quarrel, but because of the fundamental impossibility of their positions. There was not room in one kingdom, a king who would rule and a subject who would not be ruled. One of them would have to give way, and neither would the. The Woodville marriage was the spark, but the powder had been laid long before. In the very nature of the relationship between the man who made a king and the king who would not stay made. We can fill in something of how the two sisters were raised, even though the records say little of it directly. For the upbringing of great heiresses followed well-worn lines. From their earliest years they would have been schooled in everything. A noblewoman of the first rank was expected to know, to read certainly, for piety and for the management of a household required it, to sew and embroider with skill, to sing and dance and carry themselves with the grace and dignity that marked a lady of their station. They would have learned the running of a great establishment at their mother's side, the management of servants and stores and accounts, the dispensing of hospitality and charity, all the complex business of keeping a noble house. And they would have understood, long before anyone spelled it out, the one fact that governed their lives, that they were heiresses of enormous value, that their marriages would be among the most important transactions of their father's career, and that their own wishes in the matter would count for very little. Everything in their training pointed toward a single end, to be the wives of powerful men, to bear heirs, to carry a vast inheritance into a husband's family. The two girls were being prepared, in effect, for the very use to which their father would put them, trained from childhood to be the perfect instruments of a dynastic marriage. That neither of them seems ever to have rebelled against that destiny is not surprising. It was the only future they had ever been shown, and they had been raised, with great care, to accept it. The first of the daughters to be played was Isabel, the elder, and the man she was handed to was the king's brother George, the Duke of Clarence. Clarence was a glittering and treacherous figure, handsome and charming, and consumed by a restless discontent. A younger son of York, who could not bear that mere order of birth, had handed his brother Edward the crown, while he himself was merely a duke. He wanted more, always more, and his hunger made him the perfect partner for Warwick's schemes. For if the king would not advance Warwick, then Warwick would simply build his own faction around the disaffected royal brother, marry that brother to his elder daughter, and use the two of them together as the spearhead of his bid for power. Clarence, dazzled by Isabel's enormous inheritance and by Warwick's promises of greatness, agreed eagerly. There was only one difficulty. The king had expressly forbidden the match, exactly as he had forbidden any marriage between his brothers and Warwick's daughters. To marry Isabel to Clarence was therefore an act of open defiance, very nearly a declaration of war against the crown. The Earl did not hesitate. In the summer of 1469, he carried his daughter and the eager Duke across the sea to Calais, the great fortress that was the seat of his power, and there, beyond the reach of the king's prohibition, Isabel Neville was wed to the Duke of Clarence. The bride was not yet 18. She had been made with that ceremony in Calais into the living symbol of her father's rebellion, the seal on an alliance that was meant to overturn a kingdom. The choice of Calais for that wedding was no accident, and it is worth dwelling on, for it tells us how deliberate and how dangerous Warwick's defiance was. The king had forbidden the marriage. To perform it anywhere in England would have been to flout a royal command on English soil, an act of open rebellion that the king's officers might have moved to prevent. But Calais was Warwick's own fortress, beyond the sea, garrisoned by his own loyal soldiers, the one place in the world where the king's writ ran weakest and Warwick's strongest. By carrying Isabel and Clarence there to be married, Warwick was not merely defying the king, he was doing it from behind his own walls, in his own stronghold, where he could not be stopped. The location was a statement in itself, a declaration that he would do as he pleased, and that there was a place, his place, where even the king could not reach him. It was also a measure of how far things had already gone for a subject who must take a royal bride across the sea to marry her in his private fortress, against the royal command, has already crossed the line from loyal magnate to open rebel, whatever he may pretend. The wedding at Calais was the point of no return. The hour when the long-building quarrel between Warwick and the king he had made turned at last into armed defiance. And it was sealed, as so much in this story was sealed, with the marriage of a daughter, Isabel, carried to her father's fortress beyond the sea to be wedded to a prince in defiance of a king, the living instrument of the rebellion that her marriage announced. From the moment of that wedding, Isabel's life ceased to be her own in any meaningful sense and became simply an extension of her father's ambition. The marriage in Calais was immediately followed by open rebellion. Warwick and Clarence issued manifestos denouncing the king's evil counsellors, the Woodvilles, above all, and raised the north against Edward, and for a heady spell it seemed their gamble might succeed completely. Warwick's forces defeated a royal army, captured several of the hated Woodville relatives, and had them summarily executed, and then, astonishingly, took the king himself prisoner. For a few weeks in that strange autumn, the Earl held the extraordinary position of having a king in his custody, Edward IV, the very man he had made, now his captive. It was the high water mark of the Kingmaker's power, the instant when he had reached, through his daughter's marriage and his own ruthless force, very nearly to the mastery of England. And Isabel was at the centre of it, the new Duchess of Clarence. Her marriage the foundation stone of the whole edifice, her inheritance the wealth that funded it. But the triumph could not hold. He discovered that holding a captive monarch was very different from ruling through a willing one. The country would not settle, the great lords would not accept his authority, while the lawful monarch languished in custody. Order began to break down. In the end, the Earl was forced to release Edward, unable to rule the kingdom in his name, and unwilling to take the final, fatal step of destroying him. The king went free, and the balance of power, for the moment, was restored. The rebellion that followed the Calais wedding revealed another face of Warwick's power, for he was not only a great lord, but a master of popular agitation. A rebel who knew how to raise the common people against the crown. When he and Clarence moved against Edward, they did not simply summon their armed retainers. They issued manifestos, public proclamations that denounced the king's evil counsellors and promised to right the wrongs done to the common people, to lower taxes and end corruption and restore good government. It was the language of reform, of the people's champion, standing up against a grasping and misguided court, and it was extraordinarily effective. He had spent years making himself popular, with his open kitchens and his naval victories and his careful cultivation of the London crowd, and now he reaped the harvest of that popularity. A rising in the north, raised under a leader with the colourful name of Robin of Redesdale, gathered thousands to the rebel cause, and the country, weary of the Woodvilles and ready to believe the worst of the court, responded to Warwick's call. It was a remarkable thing for the greatest nobleman in the kingdom to cast himself as the friend of the common man against the king, and it tells us much about Warwick's cunning that he could play that part so convincingly. He understood, as few of his rank did, that power did not rest on land and armed men alone, but also on the goodwill of the people, and he spent that goodwill as freely as he spent his vast wealth in the service of his endless ambition. While the men of the house rode to war, its women endured the conflict in another fashion entirely, one no easier to bear through the endless ache of not knowing. A lady of rank could neither take up arms nor, very often, remove herself from the peril her menfolk faced. Her part was to wait for tidings from a field she would never see, for some word of how the day had gone, for the sight of her husband or father riding home, or else the cold report that he would not. Much of these years passed for Isabel, for Anne, and for the Countess their mother, in just that posture, their every prospect resting on the outcome of fights they could not touch. As Warwick rose in revolt, took flight, came back, and met his end at Barnet, the women of his blood watched and waited, hostage to each clash of arms, steeling themselves for whatever a rider might bring up the road. This is the quiet that the drum and trumpet accounts leave out. The patient, powerless vigil of the women, who reaped the harvest of the men's quarrels, while having no hand in the sowing. For Warwick's daughters, such waiting was the very grain of existence, the unceasing doubt, the fear of the messenger's face, the knowledge that all they had hung on distant battles decided by men they could not sway. They drifted on their father's wars as a leaf drifts on a swollen river, with little to do but wait and see what bank the current would fling them against. But nothing could be the same again, for Edward now knew beyond all doubt that his cousin and his brother were traitors, and Warwick knew that he had crossed a line from which there was no easy return. An uneasy, false reconciliation followed, both sides pretending to a peace that neither believed in, while the Earl and Clarence schemed for a fresh attempt. They raised another rebellion early in the new year, and this time it failed utterly. The rising they had counted on collapsed. The king moved against them with speed and force, and suddenly he and Clarence found themselves not the masters of England, but fugitives, fleeing for their lives toward the coast, with the royal army at their heels. They had gambled everything on a second throw and lost, and now they ran the mightiest subject in England, and the king's own brother, reduced in a matter of weeks to hunted men racing for the sea, hoping to reach their ships before the king's forces caught them, and Isabel ran with them. The young Duchess of Clarence, heavily pregnant by this time, was swept along in her father's catastrophe, fleeing the country she had been raised to help rule. Her glittering marriage turned in an instant to disaster. What lay ahead of her, on the storm-tossed crossing to come, was a grief that would have broken many a stronger woman. And it was only the first of the prices that Warwick's daughters would pay for the ambition that had made them. The strange interlude in which Warwick held a crowned king as his prisoner deserves a moment's reflection, for it exposed the limits of even his enormous power. To capture a king was one thing, to rule through a captive monarch was quite another. The Earl had imagined, perhaps, that with Edward in his hands, he could govern the kingdom in the king's name, issuing commands and dispensing justice as the master of a compliant monarch. But it did not work, and the reason is instructive. The whole authority of medieval kingship rested on the idea that the king ruled by right, freely, as God's anointed. A ruler who was visibly a prisoner, issuing commands under duress, commanded no real obedience, for everyone knew that his orders were not truly his own. The great lords would not answer summonses that came from a captive king. The machinery of government seized up. Order began to dissolve. He found that he had grasped the king, but not the kingship. That the crown's authority could not simply be transferred to whoever held the crowned head in his keeping. In the end, he was forced to release Edward, unable to rule in his name and unwilling to take the final, unthinkable step of killing an anointed sovereign. It was a lesson in the difference between power and authority, between holding a man and holding a throne, and it was a lesson that would, in a sense, be repeated at the very end, when the Earl tried again to rule through a puppet old Henry VI, and found once more that a kingdom cannot be governed through a king who is merely a tool in another man's hands. The crossing was a nightmare, and it cost Isabel the most cruel price of all. As the fugitives raced for the coast and threw themselves aboard their ships, a storm rose over the channel, and the little fleet was tossed for days on the heaving sea, unable to make a safe harbour. And it was there, in the worst of it, aboard a pitching ship in the middle of the storm, that Isabel went into labour and lost her first child. A baby committed to the waves far from any churchyard, because the ship could not reach land. It is among the most pitiable turns anywhere in this story, and to feel its full weight, we have to slow down and look at it closely, which we will do in a moment. For now it is enough to mark the bare fact of it, that Warwick's failed gamble for the throne had sent his pregnant daughter fleeing across a storm-racked sea, and that the flight cost her the baby she carried. She had been spent in her father's cause, and the cause had brought her to this. A dead child in the cold water, and a father still scheming, even now, for the crown he could not stop reaching toward. It is worth pausing on what childbirth meant for a woman of Isabel's world, for it was the great and constant danger of a noble woman's life, and Isabel met it in the worst circumstances imaginable. To bear children was the central duty of a great lady, the very purpose for which her marriage had been made, and she was expected to do it again and again, pregnancy following pregnancy across the years of her fertility. Each one carried real peril, for childbirth in that age, stripped of every protection that later medicine would bring, killed women of all ranks with terrible regularity, and the loss of a mother or a baby, or both together, was a sorrow known in every household, however high. A noble woman approaching her confinement would withdraw into a darkened chamber, attended by women, to await her hour in an atmosphere heavy with prayer and dread. For everyone knew how easily a birth could go wrong, and how little could be done if it did. This was the ordeal that each wife faced, again and again, as the price of her position. And Isabel faced it, the first time, not in a quiet chamber, with skilled women about her, but in the pitching cabin of a ship in the middle of a storm, with no proper help and no comfort of any kind. If childbirth was dangerous, even in the best circumstances, in those circumstances it was very nearly a death sentence for the child and a grave danger to the mother. That Isabel survived it at all, when her baby did not, was something. But the survival came at the cost of a grief that she would carry, and it was the first hard lesson in what it would cost her to be her father's daughter. Try, for a moment, to inhabit that scene as Isabel lived it, for it is one of the most harrowing in the story and deserves more than a passing mention. She was 18 years old, married barely a year, pregnant with her first child. Her father's great rebellion had collapsed, the king's forces were at their heels, and she had been bundled aboard a ship in a desperate flight for the coast, leaving England as a fugitive. Then the storm came, and the little fleet could not make harbour, and the ship pitched and rolled for days on the heaving sea. And in the midst of that, the howling wind, the tossing deck, the terror of the flight, the absence of any proper help, her labour began. There was no quiet chamber, no skilled midwife, no mother or sister or familiar woman to attend her, only the cramped and lurching cabin, and whatever frightened hands could be spared. She brought her child into the world in those conditions, and the child did not live, and because they could not reach land, the tiny body was given to the sea. It is almost unbearable to contemplate. A girl of 18, alone in every way that mattered, losing her first baby in a storm aboard a fleeing ship and watching it committed to the waves. Whatever she had been taught, as a child, About the duties and the dangers of her station, she learned them now in the cruelest possible form. And she learned, too, the real price of being her father's daughter, of being a piece in his game, for it was his rebellion, his failed gamble for power, that had put her on that ship in that storm and cost her her first child. The wealth and the grand marriage that had seemed her birthright had brought her, in the end, to a dead baby in a cold sea. It was a lesson she would not forget, and it was only the first of the prices she would pay. For Warwick, even this catastrophe was not the end, but merely the prelude to his most audacious stroke of all. And to reach it, he was prepared to do a thing that would have seemed, a year before, utterly unthinkable. Driven out of England, his rebellion in ruins, his elder daughter grieving her dead child, the Kingmaker did not give up. Instead, he turned to France and to the cunning and patient king who ruled there, Louis XI, a man so subtle and so endlessly scheming that his own contemporaries called him the universal spider, forever spinning webs of intrigue across the whole of Europe. Louis saw in the exiled Warwick an instrument of incalculable value, a way to strike at England and at England's ally, the Duke of Burgundy, and he set about weaving the most improbable alliance of the age. For Louis proposed to reconcile the Earl, the man who beyond all others had raised up the House of York and torn down the House of Lancaster, with the exiled queen of that broken Lancastrian house, the formidable and vengeful Margaret of Anjou. It was a union of bitter enemies. He had fought Margaret's cause for years, had helped to drive her into exile, and had been instrumental in the death of her supporters. Margaret, for her part, had reason to hate the Earl beyond almost any man alive, for it was the Yorkist victories that he had won, which had cost her a kingdom and worse. For Warwick's own father had been among those whose deaths she had ordered, just as he had been among those who destroyed her own friends. These two had every reason in the world to loathe one another, and the spider proposed to make them allies. The French king into whose web Warwick now flew deserves a fuller portrait, for he was one of the most remarkable rulers of the age, and his designs reached far beyond England. Louis XI was a strange and formidable figure, ungainly in appearance and plain in his dress, given to dressing more like a merchant than a monarch, but possessed of a mind of extraordinary subtlety and patience. His contemporaries called him the universal spider because of his endless intriguing, the way he sat at the centre of a vast web of plots and alliances that he spun and adjusted with infinite care, preferring always to gain his ends by cunning and bribery rather than by open war. His great enemy was the Duke of Burgundy, the mighty prince whose lands lay between France and the sea, and whose alliance with England threatened Louis from two directions at once. To break that alliance and weaken both Burgundy and England, Louis was willing to play the longest and most patient of games, and in the exiled, the Earl, he saw a perfect instrument. If he could reconcile he with the Lancastrians and send him back to overthrow the Yorkist Edward, who was Burgundy's ally, he would strike at both his enemies at a single stroke. It was a characteristically subtle design, and Louis pursued it with all his spider's patience, drawing the bitter enemies, the Earl and Margaret, into his web, and binding them together in a cause that served, above all, the interests of France. Warwick, for all his cunning, was in this matter the tool of a craftier man, a piece in the spider's game, even as he played his own daughters as pieces in his. There was another great power watching all of this from across the water, and its part in the story should not be forgotten, for the Duke of Burgundy was as deeply entangled in these affairs as the King of France. Burgundy was in that age one of the richest and most splendid states in Europe, its dukes ruling a sprawl of wealthy territories between France and the sea, their court the most magnificent in Christendom, outshining even the courts of kings. The Duke of Burgundy was the ally of Yorkist England and the enemy of France, and he had bound himself to the House of York by marriage, for the sister of King Edward, another Margaret. Margaret of York had been married to him and was now Duchess of Burgundy. So when the Earl allied with France and Lancaster and drove Edward from his throne, it was to Burgundy that the exiled king fled. And it was Burgundian money and Burgundian ships that helped Edward return to fight for his crown. The great powers of the continent were players in the English wars, France backing one side and Burgundy the other, each using the English quarrel to strike at its rival across the Channel. The Earl, in allying with France, had made himself the instrument of one of these powers and the enemy of the other, and the Burgundian help that brought Edward back to England was, in part, what destroyed him. The Wars of the Roses were never purely an English affair. They were tangled up with the great rivalry of France and Burgundy, and the girls of Warwick, wagered in the English quarrel, were also, at one remove, their pieces in a contest that spanned the whole of Western Europe. The price of that alliance, inevitably, was a daughter, and this time it was Anne, the younger girl, who would be spent. For the bargain that Louis brokered required a marriage to seal it, a binding of the two houses that were now, impossibly, to fight on the same side. And so it was agreed that Warwick's younger daughter, Anne Neville, scarcely 14 years old, would be married to Margaret of Anjou's only son, Edward of Lancaster, the Prince of Wales, the very heir of the house that Warwick had spent his life trying to destroy. Consider the strangeness of it. The Earl had married his elder daughter to a Yorkist prince to fight against the Lancastrians. Now he would marry his younger daughter to the Lancastrian prince to fight against the Yorkists. Isabel had been the instrument of the Yorkist rebellion. Now Anne would become the instrument of the Lancastrian restoration. And neither girl, we may be sure, had been asked what she wanted. Step back for a moment and consider the sheer audacity of what Warwick had done with his two girls. For there is nothing quite like it in the history of the age. He had taken his elder girl and married her to a Prince of York, to fight on the Yorkist side for the Yorkist cause. Then, when that cause failed him, he had taken his younger girl and married her to a Prince of Lancaster, to fight on the Lancastrian side against the very house his first girl had been married to serve. Between the two of them, his children were now bound to both sides of the great quarrel that was tearing England apart. One wedded to York, one to Lancaster, the two houses that had been slaughtering each other for a generation. Whichever side won, a daughter of his would stand beside the throne. Whichever side lost, a daughter of his would go down with it. It was a hedging of bets, so cold and so complete that it takes the breath away. The girls deployed like counters placed on opposite squares of the board so that their father could not lose whatever the dice showed. And it reveals, more starkly than anything else in his story, how the Earl regarded his children, not as people with loyalties and feelings of their own, but as instruments, assets, pieces to be played wherever they would do him the most good. The two sisters, raised together in the same nursery, were now set against each other across the deepest divide in the kingdom. Each one wagered on the destruction of the cause the other had been married to serve. No father ever used his girls more ruthlessly, or more brilliantly, or to less ultimate purpose. For in the end the brilliance availed him nothing, and both his wagers were swept from the board together. The making of that alliance produced one of the most extraordinary scenes in the whole history of the age, and it tells us everything about how far Warwick had fallen, and how badly he needed Margaret's consent, for Margaret of Anjou did not come easily to the bargain. She loathed the Earl with a queen's cold fury, and she had every reason to. He had been the great enemy of her cause, the destroyer of her hopes, and the idea of allying with him, of marrying her precious only son to his daughter, was repugnant to her in every fibre. She made he wait, she made him beg. By the accounts that have come down to us, the mightiest subject England had ever known, the Kingmaker before whom all the realm had trembled, was made to kneel before the exiled Lancastrian queen for a long time. Some say the better part of an hour, humbling himself, pleading for her agreement before she would even consent to discuss the terms. Picture the scene. Warwick, who had held a King of England prisoner, who had commanded fleets and armies, and the loyalty of half the kingdom, on his knees before a queen, with no throne and no army, begging her to accept his daughter as her son's bride. It is a measure of his desperation, and a measure too of how completely his fortunes had been reversed, that he was willing to abase himself so utterly. The man who made kings was reduced to a suppliant, kneeling before the very woman he had spent his life trying to destroy, all so that he might make one more bid for the mastery of England. And the thing that he offered, the thing that finally sealed the bargain, was his 14-year-old daughter. The woman Warwick was forced to kneel before was, in her way, as formidable a figure as he was himself, and the bitter symmetry between them is worth drawing out. Margaret of Anjou had come to England as a girl to marry the gentle, hopeless Henry VI, and finding herself married to a husband who could not rule, she had thrown herself into the defence of the throne with a fierceness that appalled her foes. She fought for her husband's throne and then for her son's inheritance with a determination that knew no limit, becoming the effective leader of the Lancastrian cause and earning, from those who hated her, the name of She-Wolf. She and the Earl had been the bitterest of enemies for years. He had helped to destroy her cause and drive her into exile, and she had ordered the deaths of men dear to him, including, it was said, his own father. There was as much blood between these two as between any two people in England. And now, by the strange arithmetic of politics, they were to be allies, their children married, their fortunes joined. The parallel between them is striking and sad. Both were ruthless. Formidable people who had given everything to the struggle for power. Both fought for the futures of their children, and both, in the end, would see those children destroyed by the very wars they waged. Margaret was, in a sense, Warwick's mirror, a parent who spent a child as a piece in the great game exactly as he did. For her son Edward of Lancaster was as much an instrument of her ambition as Anne was of Warwick's. The two of them, kneeling and consenting in that French chamber, were two of a kind, and the marriage they arranged between their children would destroy both those children within the year. For Anne, the younger sister, the alliance meant a marriage that must have felt like being handed to the enemy, and in a sense, that is exactly what it was. She had been raised, like Isabel, in a household that was the very heart of the Yorkist cause. Her father had made the Yorkist king. The House of Lancaster had been all her short life, the family's bitter foe. And now, at 14, she was to be married to the Lancastrian heir, to Edward of Lancaster, the son of the woman her father had just spent an hour on his knees before. We know little of what passed between Anne and the young prince she was given to, and less still of what she felt about it, for she left no record of her own. The marriage may have been a true one, or merely a betrothal that was never fully completed before catastrophe overtook them all. The sources are unclear, and historians still argue about it. But the meaning of it for Anne is plain enough. She had become, exactly as her sister had become, a piece in her father's game, and this time a piece played against the very cause she had been born into. If Warwick's gamble succeeded, Anne would one day be Queen of England as the wife of a restored Lancastrian king. If it failed, but that was not a thing to be dwelt on, not yet. Everything depended, as it always did, on her father's success in battle. The two sisters were now wagered on opposite sides of the same war, each one's fortune bound to the triumph of a different house, and their father, the man who had wagered them both. The young man Anne was married to is a shadowy figure, but what is recorded of him is not reassuring, and it casts a further shadow over her brief marriage. Edward of Lancaster, the Prince of Wales, had grown up in exile, the only son of Margaret of Anjou and the cherished hope of the Lancastrian cause. Raised by his fierce mother to believe in his destiny and to burn for the recovery of his father's throne. Those who met him reported a youth who talked of nothing but war and the cutting off of heads. A boy hardened by exile and schooled in vengeance, fixed on the bloody reclaiming of his inheritance. Whether this is a fair portrait or the slander of his enemies, we cannot now say, but it is the impression that has come down to us. And it does not suggest a gentle husband for a girl of 14. Anne was married to him, not for any regard between them, but purely to seal the alliance between her father and his mother. A transaction between two ambitious parents, in which the feelings of the two young people counted for nothing at all. How long they were actually together, whether the marriage was ever truly more than a formal betrothal, we do not know. What we do know is that within months of the wedding, the prince was dead, killed at Tewkesbury, and Anne was a widow before she had any chance to discover what kind of man she had been bound to. He vanishes from her story almost as soon as he enters it, a brief, grim husband chosen for her by others. Gone before she was 16, leaving her stranded on the losing side of a war she had never chosen. For a few months, astonishingly, the great gamble seemed to be working. The Earl crossed back to England in the autumn of 1470 with French ships and French money and the banner of Lancaster, and the country, weary of Edward and resentful of the Woodvilles, rose to meet him. Edward, caught unprepared and outnumbered, was forced to flee the kingdom altogether, escaping by ship to the Low Countries with his youngest brother Richard and a handful of followers, a monarch turned overnight into a penniless exile. And the Earl, master of England once more, did the thing that earned him his title once more. He brought the broken old Lancastrian king, Henry VI, up from the cell in which he had sat for years as Edward's captive, and placed him once more upon the throne. It was an event so strange that historians coined a special term for it, the readeption, the retaking of the crown by a king who had lost it. The Earl had now made two different kings of two different houses. He had pulled Edward down and raised Henry up, all within a single decade. He stood in that winter of 1470 at the very summit of his power, the man who ruled England in the name of a puppet king, with one daughter married to a Yorkist duke and another to the Lancastrian heir. He had, it seemed, outwitted them all. But the wheel that he had spun so masterfully was about to turn once more, and this turning would crush him. The months of the readeption, when Warwick ruled England as the master of the restored Henry VI, were a strange and unstable interlude, and they showed once again the hollowness of power exercised through a puppet king. Henry VI, brought up from his prison and set back upon the throne, was by this time a broken man, his mind long since failed, incapable of ruling in any real sense. He was a figurehead, a crowned symbol behind whom the Earl governed. And he did govern for a time as the master of England, dispensing the offices and the patronage of the crown, conducting its diplomacy, ruling in the name of a king who could not rule himself. But the arrangement rested on foundations of sand. The restored regime was a patchwork of former enemies forced into uneasy alliance, old Lancastrians who had suffered under York and Warwick's own followers, and the disaffected Clarence, all held together by nothing but the will of the Earl and the patronage of France. It satisfied no one fully and was trusted by no one entirely. Many who had submitted to the new order waited only to see which way the wind would blow before committing themselves. And across the sea, the exiled Edward was gathering his strength, preparing to return and fight for the crown he had lost. The readeption was less a settled government than a held breath, a brief and brittle interval that everyone sensed could not last. He had made a king for the second time, But this king was a hollow shell, and the power the Earl wielded through him was as fragile as the failing mind behind the crown. It would take only one battle to shatter the whole arrangement, and that battle was coming. There is something deeply pathetic in the figure of the old king at the centre of the readeption, and he deserves a moment of pity in this hard story. Henry VI had been King of England since he was a baby, had worn the crown for nearly 40 years, and had been, throughout, one of the most unfortunate men ever to hold it. Gentle, pious, and entirely unsuited to rule, prone to spells of madness, in which his mind withdrew altogether from the world, he had watched his kingdom torn apart by wars fought in his name and largely beyond his understanding. He had been captured, deposed, imprisoned in the Tower for years, and now in his old age he was brought out of his cell, dusted off, and set back upon the throne as the figurehead of Warwick's restored regime. A broken old man, his mind long since failed, propped up as a symbol behind which other men ruled. He understood little of what was done in his name. He was a crowned shell, a living relic of a kingship that had ceased in any real sense to be his own, and his restoration would last only months before Warwick fell at Barnet, and Henry was returned to his prison, there to die, almost certainly murdered, within weeks. There is no sadder figure in all these wars than this gentle, holy, hopeless king, shuffled on and off the throne by the hard men who fought over his crown, understanding little, controlling less, a pawn even greater and more helpless than the daughters of Warwick. He was the ultimate instrument, a king who was no more than a tool in other men's hands, and his pitiable end was the fitting close to a reign that had brought him, and his kingdom, only sorrow. The first crack in Warwick's triumph came from within his own family, from the son-in-law who had been the instrument of his first rebellion. George of Clarence, Isabel's husband, had thrown in his lot with Warwick in the expectation of enormous reward. Perhaps even, in his wildest hopes, the throne itself, for in the early days of their alliance there had been loose talk of making Clarence king in his brother's place. But the alliance with Lancaster had changed everything for Clarence, and changed it for the worse. With Henry VI restored and a Lancastrian prince married to Anne, the path to the throne now ran not toward Clarence, but toward the House of Lancaster and its heir. Clarence began to see, with mounting alarm, that he had backed a cause that would never reward him as he wished, that he had helped to restore the very dynasty whose triumph would leave him with nothing. He was, besides, the brother of the exiled king, bound to Edward by blood, however he had betrayed him, and as Edward prepared to return and fight for his crown, Clarence faced a choice. He could stand with his father-in-law and the Lancastrian cause, or he could betray the Earl as he had once betrayed Edward, and creep back to his brother's side. Clarence, true to the faithlessness that ran through his life, chose betrayal. In secret negotiations, he agreed to abandon he and rejoin Edward, and when the moment came, he switched sides, taking his men over to the brother he had wronged and leaving his father-in-law weakened at the worst possible hour. Isabel's husband had deserted Isabel's father. The marriage that had bound them was now a thread stretched across a battlefield, with the Earl on one side and Clarence on the other, and Isabel herself caught helplessly between them. Clarence is one of the most consistently treacherous figures of the entire age, and his desertion of Warwick was wholly in character. For betrayal was the thread that ran through his life. He was a man consumed by ambition, out of all proportion to his judgment, forever convinced that he deserved more than he had, forever ready to change sides in pursuit of it. He had betrayed his brother the king to join Warwick. Now he betrayed the Earl to rejoin his brother. And in the years to come he would intrigue and scheme until at last even his patient brother could endure him no longer. There was a restlessness in Clarence, a discontent that no reward could ever satisfy, that made him incapable of loyalty to anyone but himself. What drove his desertion of Warwick was, characteristically, a calculation of self-interest. He had joined the Earl in the hope of a throne, or at least of greatness. But the alliance with Lancaster had dashed those hopes, for a restored Lancastrian dynasty would have no place for a York prince, and Clarence saw that he had backed a cause that could only diminish him. So he did what he always did when a bargain turned against him. He abandoned it. He slipped back to his brother's side, betraying the father-in-law whose daughter he had married, and left he weaker at the very moment he most needed strength. It was the act of a man who could be loyal to no cause and no person, only to his own endless, unsatisfied wanting, and it helped to seal Warwick's doom. Isabel's husband had a gift for treachery, and he exercised it, in the end, against everyone who ever trusted him. There is a bitter justice, of a kind, in the fact that Warwick was undone in the end by the very weapon he had relied upon. The marriage of a daughter to bind a powerful man to his cause. He had married Isabel to Clarence precisely to secure the royal duke's loyalty, to make the king's brother his ally, by the strongest tie he knew. And it was Clarence, that same son-in-law, who deserted him at the decisive moment and helped to bring him down. The marriage that was meant to bind Clarence to Warwick proved no bond at all when Clarence's interest pointed the other way. The alliance sealed with Isabel's hand dissolved the instant it ceased to serve the Duke's ambition. It is a sharp lesson in the limits of Warwick's whole method, his faith in marriages as the cement of alliances. A marriage could bind two families on paper, could create a tie of blood and obligation, but it could not make a faithless man faithful, could not hold an ally whose advantage lay elsewhere. He had spent his girls to buy loyalty, and the loyalty he bought with Isabel turned out to be worthless when it was tested, for Clarence was loyal to nothing but himself. There is a grim irony in it, that the Kingmaker, so cunning in the deploying of his daughters, should be destroyed by the failure of the very alliance a daughter's marriage was meant to secure. He had wagered Isabel on Clarence's faith, and Clarence had none, and the wager was lost along with everything else. The daughters were spent, and the spending bought him in the end. Not the loyalty he sought, but the betrayal that helped to kill him. Edward returned to England in the spring of 1471, landing with a small force and gathering strength as he marched, and the final reckoning between the king and the man who had made him came at last on a field called Barnet, just north of London, on Easter Sunday morning. It was a battle fought in conditions so strange that they have haunted the imagination ever since. For a thick fog lay over the field that morning, so dense that the two armies could barely see one another. And in that blind grey murk, the whole shape of the fighting went awry. The lines became misaligned in the mist. Part of Warwick's own army, wheeling in the fog, fell by mistake upon another part of his force, and in the confusion a cry of treason went up. Men who could not see 10 paces before them panicked, broke, and turned upon their neighbours, and the Lancastrian army began to come apart, not from the enemy's blows, but from its own blind disorder. Through all of it, somewhere in the fog, was Warwick himself, the Kingmaker, the greatest of all English subjects, who had set up one king and pulled down another, fighting now for his life in a battle, dissolving into chaos around him. He had always before known how to read a battle, how to seize the moment and bend the day to his will. But no one could read a battle fought in fog like that. The day was slipping away from him, and the king he had twice made, and once unmade, was winning. Warwick died at Barnet, and the manner of his death was as bleak as the fog that swallowed the field. As his army broke and the rout began, the Earl tried to escape, to reach the horses at the rear and ride clear of the disaster. But he was a big man, weighed down by heavy armour, and the press of fleeing and pursuing men was deadly, and he did not reach the horses in time. He was overtaken, brought down, and killed, cut off from his men, and slain in the chaos of the rout. The most powerful nobleman in England, dispatched like any common soldier in the murk of an Easter morning. When the fog at last began to lift and the killing was done, his body was found among the slain, stripped of its rich armour, and the man who had ruled the kingdom lay dead on the wet grass. Edward, who had once been his creature, ordered the body taken to London, where it was put on public display so that all could see, beyond any doubt, that the Kingmaker was truly dead, that the great spider who had spun the politics of England for a decade would spin no more. And then he had it carried away to be buried quietly among the other Nevilles, at the abbey where his family lay. So ended Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the maker of kings, brought down at last on a foggy field by the very king he had raised. He was 42 years old. He left behind him no son to carry his name, and 2 daughters whose fates now hung, more precarious than ever, upon the wreckage of everything he had built. The display of Warwick's body in London afterward was a deliberate and meaningful act, and it tells us something about the strange power the Kingmaker had held even over those who destroyed him. When a great man fell in those wars, his death was often doubted, for rumour could turn a dead lord into a living one and keep a broken cause alive on false hope. Edward understood this. And he understood too that Warwick had been so mighty, so much larger than life, that men would scarcely believe he was truly gone. And so he had the body brought to London and laid out in public, in the open, for all to come and see. The great Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker before whom all the realm had trembled, stretched lifeless for the crowds to file past and gaze upon. It was proof, undeniable proof, that the spider was dead, that the man who had spun the politics of England for a decade would spin no more, that there was no point in any further resistance in his name. The public exhibition of the corpse was a kind of political theatre, a way of ending not just the man, but the myth, of showing the people beyond all doubt that the age of the Kingmaker was over. And then, the point made, Edward allowed the body to be taken away and buried with his ancestors at Bisham Abbey, among the Nevilles, the resting place of his family. So the greatest subject England ever produced was put on show like a fairground curiosity and then quietly interred. His vast power reduced in the end to a body on display and a grave among his kinspeople. The catastrophe at Barnet was only the beginning of the family's ruin, for on the very day that her father died, Anne was crossing the sea toward England to share in a triumph that had already turned to ashes. Anne had remained in France with Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrian court, while Warwick went ahead to prepare the way, and the Queen and the young bride sailed for England, believing they were coming to join a victorious cause. They landed to the news that the Earl was dead, his army broken. The whole gamble collapsed before they had even arrived. There could be no turning back. They were committed now, and the remnants of the Lancastrian cause gathered what forces they could for a final, desperate stand. It came a few weeks after Barnet, at Tewkesbury, in the west of England, and it was an even more complete disaster than the battle that had killed Warwick. Edward fell upon the Lancastrian army and destroyed it utterly. And in the slaughter and its aftermath, the last hopes of the House of Lancaster were extinguished. Among the dead was Edward of Lancaster, the Prince of Wales Anne's young husband, the boy she had been married to in France to seal her father's alliance. He was killed at Tewkesbury, either in the fighting or in its brutal aftermath, and with his death Anne's brief marriage was over, almost before it had begun. She was 15 years old, and in the space of a few weeks she had lost her father at Barnet and her husband at Tewkesbury, and seen the entire cause she had been wagered upon annihilated. The piece her father had played on the Lancastrian side of the board had been swept off it, and Anne was left with nothing, a widow at 15, the daughter of a dead traitor, the relict of a dead enemy, with no protector and no clear place in a world that had just been turned upside down. Tewkesbury did more than widow Anne. It extinguished the House of Lancaster almost entirely, snuffing out in a single bloody afternoon a dynasty that had ruled England for 3 generations, with the death of Edward of Lancaster, the Prince of Wales. The direct male line of Lancaster was ended, for he had been the last hope of his house, the only son of the only surviving line. And his death was swiftly followed by another, for within a short time of Tewkesbury, the old king, Henry VI, met his end inside the Tower, where he had been shut away again as a prisoner once Warwick fell. The official story was that he died of grief and melancholy at the destruction of his cause and the death of his son. Few believed it then, and fewer believe it now, for the timing was far too convenient, coming just when his death served the victorious Edward so perfectly. With the son dead at Tewkesbury and the father dead in the Tower, the House of Lancaster was finished, its claim extinguished, its line run out. The cause for which Margaret of Anjou had fought so long and so fiercely was destroyed utterly, her husband and her son both dead, herself a captive. And Warwick's last great gamble, the alliance he had knelt to make, lay in ruins along with the dynasty he had tried to restore. He had spent his younger daughter to bind himself to Lancaster, and Lancaster was now no more, leaving Anne a widow at 15, with nothing to show for the bargain but her grief and her danger. For the mother of these 2 ruined girls, the disaster brought a peculiar and bitter ordeal of its own, and it is a part of the story too often forgotten. The Countess of Warwick Anne Beauchamp, whose own inheritance had made her husband great, had also crossed to England in that doomed season, and she too landed to the news of her husband's death. Understanding at once that she was now the widow of an attainted traitor, and that her life and her vast property were in mortal danger, she fled into sanctuary, taking refuge in an abbey on the south coast and throwing herself upon the mercy of the very king her husband had died fighting. She wrote to Edward, protesting that she was his true and loyal subject, begging for her safety and the protection of her rights. But the Countess had something that powerful men wanted very badly indeed, that same colossal inheritance, the Warwick and Beauchamp and Despencer estates, the richest accumulation of land in the kingdom, and her widowhood and her sanctuary made her vulnerable as she had never been before. What followed was one of the most cynical episodes of the whole age. The king's 2 brothers, Clarence and Gloucester, set about seizing the Countess's living inheritance for themselves, and to do it they were prepared to commit an act of breathtaking legal violence. They arranged for Parliament to treat the Countess, a living and healthy woman, as though she were legally dead, so that her inheritance could pass at once to her daughters, and through them to the 2 royal brothers who had married them. A breathing, healthy woman was treated by Act of Parliament as if she had already died, so that her sons-in-law might carve up her estates between them while she still lived. The Countess of Warwick would spend years in sanctuary and then in a kind of genteel captivity, stripped of the inheritance that was hers by right, robbed in the name of her own daughters by the men those daughters had married. The legal device by which the Countess of Warwick was robbed deserves to be understood, for it was a piece of cynicism remarkable even in a cynical age. Ordinarily, the inheritance of a great estate was governed by careful law, and a living owner could not simply be dispossessed at the whim of others. The Countess was alive, and the vast Warwick and Beauchamp and Despencer lands were hers by right of her own blood, not her dead husband's. In justice, they should have remained hers for her lifetime, passing to her heirs only at her death. But the 2 royal brothers wanted those lands now, while she lived, and they had the power to bend Parliament to their will. So they procured an act that did something genuinely monstrous. It ordered that the Countess be reckoned, where her lands were concerned, exactly as if she had already died, that her living person should be legally ignored, her rights extinguished, her property passed to her daughters and their husbands as if she had died. A woman in good health, who would in fact live for another 20 years and more, was declared a legal corpse so that her sons-in-law could seize her wealth at once. It was robbery dressed in the forms of law, the machinery of justice turned to the service of naked greed, and it was done to a woman who had committed no crime but the possession of a fortune that powerful men coveted. The Countess protested, wrote letters, pleaded her loyalty and her rights. It availed her nothing. The law had declared her dead, and the dead have no property. She would spend the years that followed stripped of everything, a living ghost robbed in the name of her own children. There is a deep irony in the fate of the Warwick inheritance that gathers up much of the meaning of this whole story, and it is worth drawing out. That vast fortune had been the making of the family. It was the inheritance Anne Beauchamp brought that turned Richard Neville into the Kingmaker. It was the wealth that funded his armies and bought his popularity and underwrote his bid for mastery of England. It was the prize that made his daughters the most desirable heiresses in the kingdom and drew royal princes to marry them. The fortune was the engine of everything, the greatness, the ambition, the grand marriages, the towering edifice of Neville power. And yet that same fortune became, in the end, a curse upon everyone it touched. It was fought over so bitterly that it set brother against brother and sister against sister. It was stolen from the very woman whose blood had brought it. It made the family's children so dangerous, as carriers of wealth and royal blood, that they were imprisoned and executed for it. The inheritance that raised the family up destroyed it, generation by generation, until almost nothing was left. There is an old wisdom in the spectacle about the way that great wealth, so eagerly sought, can become a kind of poison to those who possess it, drawing envy and violence and ruin in its train. The Warwick fortune was one of the greatest in England, and it brought the family that held it not happiness or security, but a long cascade of catastrophe, rebellion, exile, theft, imprisonment, and death. They had everything, and everything destroyed them. It is the oldest of cautionary tales, written in the blood of one of the richest families in the land. And so the two sisters, who had been the richest heiresses in England, became instead the focus of a sordid scramble over their mother's stolen wealth, fought over, not for themselves, but for the fortune they carried. With Warwick dead and the Lancastrian cause destroyed, the question that consumed the court was no longer who would rule England. Edward had settled that at Barnet and Tewkesbury, but who would get the Warwick inheritance? Isabel, the elder, was already married to Clarence, who naturally wished to claim the whole of it through his wife. But there was Anne to consider, the younger sister, now a widow, who was co-heiress to half of that enormous fortune. Whoever married Anne would gain a claim to half the Warwick lands, and that made the 15-year-old widow, despite her ruined circumstances, one of the most valuable marriage prizes in the kingdom once again. Her own brother-in-law, Clarence, had every reason to prevent her marrying at all, for as long as Anne remained single and in his control, he might hope to engross the entire inheritance for himself. But another man wanted Anne and wanted the wealth she carried, and he was not a man easily denied. He was the king's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the same Richard who would one day be king himself. And his pursuit of Anne Neville would set brother against brother in a quarrel over the spoils of the dead Kingmaker. The quarrel between the two royal brothers over Anne and her inheritance is one of the least edifying episodes in a thoroughly unedifying age. And Anne herself, was its helpless object. Richard of Gloucester wanted to marry her, partly, no doubt, because he had known her since childhood, for he had spent some of his boyhood in Warwick's household at Middleham, and the two had grown up in the same halls, and partly, certainly, because marriage to Anne would bring him a claim to half the vast Warwick fortune. Clarence was determined to prevent it. As the husband of the elder sister, he wanted the entire inheritance for himself, and the surest way to keep it was to keep Anne unmarried and under his control. According to the stories that have come down to us, Clarence went so far as to hide Anne away, concealing his own sister-in-law so that Gloucester could not find her and marry her. And there is a famous tale, which may or may not be true, that Anne was discovered disguised as a kitchen servant in London, hidden among the cooks and scullions to keep her from her suitor. Whether or not that particular detail is true, the essence of it is well attested. The two brothers wrangled bitterly over the girl and her fortune, with Anne treated throughout not as a person with any will of her own, but as a prize to be hidden, found, and claimed. In the end, Gloucester prevailed. He found Anne, or won her, or simply asserted his claim with enough force to overcome his brother's resistance, and the two were married, despite all of Clarence's efforts to prevent it. Anne Neville, who had been a Lancastrian princess in waiting a year before, was now the Duchess of Gloucester, wedded to the youngest of the king's brothers, and the wheel of her fortune, which had cast her so low, had lifted her once more, though to a future no one could yet read. The famous tale of Anne hidden as a kitchen maid deserves to be examined, for whether or not it is literally true, it captures something essential about her situation. The tale, as it has come down to us, holds that Clarence, determined to keep Anne unmarried and her inheritance whole, concealed his sister-in-law somewhere in London, disguising her as a servant among the cooks and scullions of a city household so that Gloucester could not find her and claim her. Gloucester, the account continues, searched until he discovered her in this lowly disguise and carried her off to safety and sanctuary. Historians treat the tale with caution, for it comes from a single chronicle and has the shape of a good yarn, the kind of thing that grows in the telling. But true or not, it tells us how Anne was regarded by the men around her, not as a person with rights and wishes, but as a valuable object to be hidden or seized. A prize in a contest between two grasping brothers. Even if she was never literally dressed as a kitchen maid, she was certainly the helpless object of her brother-in-law's schemes, hidden away or controlled to suit his designs on her fortune. The detail of the disguise may be embroidery, but the essence is sober truth. A young widow of the highest birth, heiress to half a great fortune, treated as a thing to be concealed and fought over, with no more say in her fate than any object of value passed between covetous men. That is the real meaning of the kitchen maid story, and it is true whether the disguise is or not. There was a further complication to the marriage of Anne and Gloucester that is easy to overlook but mattered greatly at the time, and that is the tangle of church law in which it was caught. Anne and Richard were closely related cousins, of a kind bound by the web of Neville and York kinship, and they were connected too by Anne's first marriage, for her dead first husband had stood, to Richard, within a degree of kinship that the Church counted. By the strict rules of the medieval Church, such connections raised real impediments to a marriage, the kind of thing that ordinarily required a special dispensation from the highest authority in Rome before a wedding could lawfully proceed. Whether all the necessary dispensations were obtained, and in proper form, is a question that has exercised historians, for the records are incomplete, and there are signs that the marriage may have gone ahead without every impediment being fully cleared. It is a technical matter, but it was not a trivial one, for the validity of a marriage and the legitimacy of its children could turn on such points. and in an age when a defective marriage could later be challenged for political advantage, these were dangerous loose ends. For Anne, caught up once more in the schemes of the men around her, the niceties of canon law were one more thing decided over her head. One more arrangement made for her rather than by her. The marriage went ahead, dispensations or no, because Gloucester wanted it and was powerful enough to have it. Whether it was, in the strictest sense, wholly lawful, remained a shadow over it, the kind of shadow that in that age could one day be turned into a weapon. The quarrel between Clarence and Gloucester over the Warwick inheritance is worth lingering on, for it shows how the wars, even in their lulls, never really stopped. They simply changed their weapons. With the Lancastrians destroyed and the kingdom at peace, the two royal brothers turned their energies from the battlefield to the law courts and the council chamber, fighting now not with armies, but with lawyers and acts of parliament over the division of a dead man's lands. The dispute dragged on for years, bitter and unrelenting, each brother grasping for the larger share, each marshalling his arguments and his influence, the king himself forced to mediate between his quarrelling siblings. It was an ugly, grasping, undignified business, and it poisoned the relations between the two brothers in a way that would have lasting consequences, feeding the suspicion and resentment that would, in the end, contribute to Clarence's destruction. And at the centre of it, as the prize over which the brothers wrangled, were the two sisters and their inheritance. Isabel and Anne, reduced to the stakes in a squalid legal contest between their husbands. The wars had given way to peace, but the grasping for wealth and advantage went on as fiercely as ever, and the girls of Warwick remained, as they had always been, the counters in other people's games. There is something telling in the spectacle of these two royal brothers, who had fought side by side against the Lancastrians, now at each other's throats over land and money, the moment the common enemy was gone. It was a foretaste of the self-destruction to come. The House of York, unable to stay united once it had nothing left to unite against, and the Warwick inheritance was the first bone they fought over. With both daughters now married to royal brothers, the final carve-up of the inheritance could proceed, and it proceeded with a cynicism that is breathtaking, even by the standards of the time. The two brothers, having married the two sisters, now divided the Warwick lands between them, as though they were splitting the spoils of a conquest, which, in a sense, they were. The living Countess of Warwick, the true owner of most of that wealth, was simply written out of the reckoning, her rights ignored, her inheritance parcelled out between her sons-in-law as if she did not exist. Parliament obligingly passed the acts required to make the theft legal, treating the Countess as dead in law so that her daughters and their husbands could take everything. Isabel and Anne, the two sisters, thus became the channels through which their mother's fortune flowed into the hands of Clarence and Gloucester, and the relationship between the two couples was poisoned for years by the wrangling over who should get what. It is a grim irony that the inheritance which had made the sisters so desirable, which had been the engine of their father's greatness and the reason for their own glittering marriages, became in the end a source of bitterness and division. Setting sister against sister and brother against brother in a long, sordid dispute over land and money. The wealth that Anne Beauchamp had brought to her marriage, that had made Richard Neville the Kingmaker, was now fought over like carrion by the men who had married her daughters, while the Countess herself lived on in obscurity, robbed in the name of her own children. And here the very fortune that should have united the two sisters instead set them at odds. Isabel and Anne now stood on opposite sides of the inheritance dispute, their husbands locked in a bitter rivalry, each couple grasping for the larger share of the Warwick lands. The records that survive are concerned with the men and the money, not with what the women made of it. But the shape of it is clear enough. They had been wagered on opposite sides of a war by their father, and now, in a sense, they were wagered on opposite sides of a peace. the long, cold dispute over the inheritance that his death had left unresolved. The Kingmaker was gone, but the game he had begun with his daughters went on without him, and his girls were still the pieces in it. The fate of the two sisters illuminates a hard truth about the lives of women in their world, and it is worth stating plainly. A great heiress was, in the cold logic of the age, a kind of property, a carrier of land and wealth, whose marriage transferred that wealth to a husband and his family. The law of the time gave a married woman almost no independent standing. Her lands and goods passed largely into her husband's control, and her own wishes in the matter of her marriage counted for little against the interests of her family. An heiress was therefore both immensely valuable and almost entirely powerless. Prized for the fortune she carried, and yet unable to control its disposal or her own. Wardship, the right to control the marriage of an heir or heiress, was bought and sold like any other commodity. A girl's hand could be granted, traded, or seized along with the lands that came with it. Isabel and Anne were the supreme examples of this pattern, the richest heiresses of their generation, and their lives show with brutal clarity what it meant. They were married to serve their father's ambition. Their inheritance fought over by their husbands, their persons hidden and seized and bargained for. And through all of it, their own desires were never once consulted in any record that survives. They were valuable beyond almost any women in England, and they were, for that very reason, among the least free. The wealth that should have given them power instead made them prizes, and prizes have no will of their own. In the Sisters of Warwick, the whole condition of the noble heiress is written large, treasured, traded, and never once asked. It is worth pausing to wonder about the bond between Isabel and Anne themselves, the human relationship beneath all the politics. For they were sisters before they were pawns, and they shared a childhood that no one else could ever share. They had grown up together in the same nurseries at Warwick and at Middleham, the only two surviving children of their parents, close in the way that sisters thrown much together become close. With no brother to divide their parents' attention, and no one else in the world quite like the other. Whatever befell them afterward, that early bond was real, forged in the shared experience of a strange and privileged childhood. And then the world set them at odds, married them to rival brothers, divided them over their mother's stolen inheritance, placed them on opposite sides of a bitter dispute over land and money. The records say nothing of how the sisters bore this, whether they stayed close in their hearts despite their husband's quarrel or were driven apart by it. But it is hard not to grieve for them a little. The two who had been everything to each other in childhood, now set against each other in a squalid adult struggle they had not chosen. When Isabel died, Anne became the only soul alive who had shared that childhood, the last who carried it in memory. We will return to that thought at the very end. For now it is enough to hold the simple fact of it, that before they were ever pieces in anyone's game, they were sisters, and that bond was the first and oldest thing about them. For all that they were used as instruments, the two sisters did rise, through their marriages, to positions of real rank, and even in Anne's case, to the highest place a woman could hold. And the strange doubleness of their situation is worth noting. They were at once among the most exalted women in the land, and among the least free of any. Isabel, as Duchess of Clarence, was the wife of the king's brother, a great lady of the royal house, addressed with all the deference due to her rank. Anne, in the end, was crowned queen, the first lady of the entire kingdom. By any outward measure they reached the very heights. And yet, at every step of that ascent, they were carried rather than choosing, married where they were told, fought over without being consulted. Their grand positions, the result of other men's schemes rather than their own wills. To be a duchess or a queen sounds like the summit of fortune, and in one sense it was. But for Isabel and Anne, these grand titles came without the freedom that we might imagine should accompany them. For they had been placed in their high positions exactly as they had been placed everywhere else, as the instruments of ambitions not their own. The crown that came to Anne was not something she had sought or won. It descended on her because the man she had been married to seized the throne, and it brought her, as we have seen, far more sorrow than joy. The two sisters illustrate a hard truth about even the most exalted women of their age, that rank and power were not the same thing, that a woman might stand at the very summit of the kingdom and yet have almost no control over her own fate. They were a duchess and a queen, and they were, to the end, the pieces in their father's and their husband's games. In the end, when all the politics and the battles and the inheritance disputes are stripped away, what remains is two sisters and the strange shape of their shared life. They began together in the nurseries of Warwick and Middleham, the only children of the mightiest subject in England, raised side by side in extraordinary wealth and privilege, with the whole of their lives still before them. And then the world took them and pulled them apart and used them, each in her turn, sending them down separate roads of grief. Isabel to the storm and the lost baby and an early death. Anne to the Lancastrian marriage and the widowhood and the hollow crown. And yet, beneath everything that came after, there is something that endures in that shared beginning. Two children in the firelight of a great hall before any of it, when they were simply themselves and each other, before the world made them into pieces in a game. Whatever was done to them later, that beginning was real, and it is perhaps the truest thing about them, truer than the duchess or the queen they became, truer than the fortune they carried or the men they were given to. They were the most valuable heiresses in England, and they were, also, two children who loved each other once, in a castle in the north, a long time ago, when both of them were gone, before either had reached 30, the world was a little emptier for the loss of them, though it scarcely paused to notice. The elder sister was the first to die, and she died young, as so many women of that age did, worn out by the relentless cycle of childbearing that was the lot of a great lady expected to provide her husband with heirs. Isabel bore Clarence several children across the years of their marriage, though only two of them survived infancy, a daughter, Margaret, and a son, Edward. In the closing weeks of the year 1476, she gave birth once more to a son named Richard, and the birth seems to have ruined her health entirely. The baby did not live long, and Isabel herself, weakened by the confinement, sickened and died in the days before Christmas of that year at Warwick Castle, where she had been born. She was 25 years old. By the standards of the age, there was nothing remarkable in it. A young noblewoman dying soon after childbirth was among the commonest of tragedies, and the likeliest truth is simply that Isabel died of the complications of her last pregnancy, as countless women did. But her husband Clarence could not accept so ordinary an explanation. Half mad with grief and with the suspicion that ran in his unstable nature, he convinced himself that Isabel had been poisoned, murdered by some enemy, and he set about pursuing his fantasy with a violence that would help to destroy him. He seized a woman of Isabel's household, accused her of poisoning the duchess, and had her tried and hanged on his own private authority. Riding roughshod over the king's justice, in his determination to avenge a murder that had almost certainly never happened. It was the act of a man unhinged, and it set Clarence on the final, fatal collision with his brother the king that would shortly end his life. Isabel, who had been spent in her father's cause and then fought over in the scramble for her mother's wealth, was dead at 25, and even her death became the occasion for fresh violence and folly, the trigger for her husband's ruin. The rumour that Isabel was poisoned deserves to be weighed honestly, for it has clung to her death across the centuries, and the truth of it matters. The charge arose from her husband Clarence, who, deranged by grief, became convinced that his wife had been murdered and pursued his conviction with lethal violence. But there is almost no reason to believe it. Isabel died in the way that countless women of her age died, in the weeks following a difficult childbirth, worn down by the ordeal of bearing a child and unable to recover from it. Her newborn son died too, shortly after, which is exactly the pattern of a birth gone wrong. Mother and infant, both lost to the perils of the lying-in. There was no need for poison to explain her death. The ordinary dangers of childbirth explained it entirely. Clarence's insistence on murder says far more about his own unstable mind than about any real evidence, and the woman he had hanged for the supposed crime was almost certainly an innocent victim of his derangement. Why, then, has the poison rumour survived? Partly because Clarence pressed it so violently at the time, partly because the world of these wars was so steeped in real murder that a poisoning seemed plausible, and partly because there is a grim appetite for dark explanations of the deaths of the great. But the sober judgment of history is that Isabel Neville died of natural causes, the ordinary and terrible causes that killed so many women of her age, and that the tale of poison was the fantasy of a grieving and unbalanced husband. Not a fact. She needed no murderer. Childbirth was murder enough. For Clarence did not long outlive his wife, and his end was as dark as anything in this dark story. Isabel's death seemed to unmoor him entirely. His behaviour grew wilder and more dangerous. He defied the king's authority, muttered against the legitimacy of the crown, and conducted himself as though no law applied to him. He had betrayed Edward twice already and been forgiven twice, but Edward's patience, long as it was, finally ran out. In the early weeks of 1478, Clarence was arrested, charged with treason, and condemned to death by the judgment of Parliament. Condemned in effect by his own brother the king. And then, within the walls of the Tower of London, the sentence was carried out in secret, in a manner that has become one of the most famous and grotesque legends of the age. That Clarence, given the choice of how he should die, chose to be drowned in a barrel of sweet wine. Whether or not that strange detail is true, the fact is certain enough. George of Clarence, Isabel's husband, the king's own brother, was put to death in the Tower on Edward's order, less than 2 years after Isabel herself had died. The two of them, husband and wife, were both gone before their 30th year. Their glittering marriage ended in death and disgrace, leaving behind 2 small orphan children to inherit the wreckage, and those children carried in their veins the Warwick blood and the royal blood both, a dangerous inheritance that would bring its own catastrophes in the years to come. The elder sister and her husband had been destroyed, as her father had been destroyed, by the relentless logic of the game they had all been playing, the endless reaching for power that consumed one after another. Almost everyone who touched it, the legend of the barrel of wine, deserves a word, for it is among the most famous deaths in English history, and yet its truth is uncertain. The story holds that Clarence, condemned to die and granted the small mercy of choosing his own manner of death, asked to be drowned in a great vat of Malmsey, the sweet wine he was said to love, and that his wish was granted within the Tower walls. It is a strange and memorable tale, and it has fixed itself in the popular memory so firmly that Clarence is remembered, if for nothing else, for the manner of his drowning. Whether it is true, no one can say for certain. The fact of his secret execution in the Tower is beyond doubt. The manner of it is not. It is possible that the Malmsey story is literal truth. Possible that it is a grim joke that grew up around a private execution. Possible that it preserves some garbled memory of how he actually died. What is certain is that Clarence, the king's own brother, was put quietly to death within the Tower on Edward's authority, his treasons at last exhausting a patience that had forgiven him twice before. the wine, true or not, has given his death a lurid fame that has rather obscured the real meaning of it, that the House of York had now begun to devour itself, brother killing brother, exactly as it would do again 5 years later when another of Edward's brothers reached for the crown. The Malmsey is a colourful detail. The fratricide is the real story, and it needed no barrel of wine to make it terrible. The execution of Clarence by his own brother was part of a larger and darker pattern, the slow turning of the House of York against itself, and it is worth seeing whole. The Yorkist dynasty had come to the throne united, 3 brothers, Edward, Clarence and Richard, bound together against the common Lancastrian enemy. But once that enemy was destroyed and the throne secured, the brothers began to turn on one another, the bonds of blood proving weaker than the temptations of power. First Clarence rebelled, and was forgiven, and rebelled again, and was at last destroyed by Edward. Then, when Edward died, his brother Richard set aside Edward's young sons and took the throne for himself, and those boys, the princes in the Tower, vanished into a silence that has never been broken. Brother destroyed brother. Uncle supplanted nephews. The house that had won the crown together tore itself apart over the keeping of it. Warwick and his daughters were caught in the early stages of this self-destruction. Clarence, one daughter's husband, executed by his brother, and Richard, the other daughter's husband, soon to seize the throne and lose it. The House of York devoured itself within a single generation, and the Neville sisters, married into it, were devoured along with it. There is a grim instruction in the spectacle of how a family bound together in adversity can fall to pieces in triumph, how the very success that united the brothers against their enemies freed them to turn on one another once the enemies were gone. The Kingmaker had helped to raise that house. He lived to see it begin to consume itself, and his daughters were among the first it consumed. The orphan children of Isabel and Clarence deserve a moment of their own, for their fates show how long the shadow of the Kingmaker's ambition stretched. There were 2 of them who lived, a daughter Margaret, whose own long and finally tragic story we will come to shortly, and a son, Edward, named Earl of Warwick after his grandfather, who had perhaps the saddest fate of all. He was the last male of the direct Plantagenet line, the senior surviving descendant in the male line of the old royal house. And that simple fact of his birth made him so dangerous to those who held the throne that he was shut away in the Tower of London as a boy and kept there, a prisoner, for most of his life, guilty of nothing but his blood. In the end, he too was put to death, executed as a young man because his mere existence threatened a new dynasty. The grandchildren of the Kingmaker inherited his blood and his claim, and that inheritance proved as deadly to them as it had to him. The Earl had reached for greatness through his bloodline. That same bloodline became, for his descendants, a sentence of death. The wealth and the royal blood that had made the family great destroyed it in the end, generation after generation, until almost nothing was left. The story of Isabel's daughter Margaret is worth telling more fully, for it stretches the shadow of the Kingmaker's blood across the whole of the next age. Margaret, the little girl orphaned by her mother's death and her father's execution, grew up to marry and to become, in time, the Countess of Salisbury in her own right, one of the great ladies of the Tudor court, and for a while the governess of a future queen. She was learned, pious, and widely respected, and she lived into her later 60s, long after the wars of her childhood had faded into history. But the royal blood she carried, the Plantagenet inheritance that came down to her through her father, made her forever an object of suspicion to the Tudor kings who had supplanted her family. In the savage final years of one of those kings, as he grew ever more fearful of any rival blood, Margaret was arrested on charges that were almost certainly false, held in the Tower, and at last put to death, a frail woman in her late 60s, dragged to a scaffold and butchered by an inexpert headsman in one of the most appalling executions of the age. Her only crime was her blood, the same Plantagenet blood that had made her grandfather the Kingmaker and her father a duke. The wars that had begun before her birth reached out, decades later, to kill her. The granddaughter of Warwick destroyed at last by the very inheritance that had made her family great. It is one of the bleakest of the many bleak endings in this story, and it shows how long and how far the curse of that dangerous blood would run. The younger sister outlived the elder, but not by very much, and her brief ascent to the highest place in the land brought her little but grief. After Isabel's death and Clarence's execution, Anne and her husband Richard of Gloucester lived for some years in the north of England, where Richard governed in the king's name, and where Anne, by all accounts, found a measure of stability and even contentment. Raising their one son at Middleham, the castle where she herself had grown up. But that stability did not last. In the spring of 1483, King Edward died without warning, and in the turmoil that followed, Richard of Gloucester reached for the throne, setting aside his brother's young sons and having himself crowned as King Richard III. And so Anne Neville, the daughter of the Kingmaker, was lifted to the very summit that her father had spent his life pursuing. She was crowned Queen of England, the consort of a reigning king. It was the destiny her father had wagered her toward. First on the Lancastrian side, and now on the Yorkist, and at last, by a strange and crooked path, it had come to her. But it brought her almost nothing of joy. The crown sat on her head for barely 2 years, and they were years of mounting sorrow. Her only son, the boy she had raised at Middleham, the heir to the throne, died in childhood, not long after his parents were crowned, a blow from which Anne never recovered. And then Anne herself, never strong, fell ill consumptive, wasted, fading, and died in the early spring of 1485. Still a young woman, barely 28 years old. She did not live to see the final ruin of her husband's cause, which came only months later when Richard was killed at Bosworth and the House of York was swept from the throne forever. But she had lived long enough to taste the crown her father had died reaching for, and to find it bitter. Before the final ascent and the final sorrows, there was an interval of something like peace in Anne's life, and it deserves to be marked, for it was the nearest thing to happiness her short years afforded her. After the storms of her girlhood, the Lancastrian marriage, the death of her husband, the wrangling over her hand, Anne settled with Richard in the north of England, in the country of her girlhood, and for a decade or so she lived there as the Duchess of Gloucester, well away from the centre of power, in the world of Middleham and the northern dales that she knew from childhood. Richard governed the north in his brother's name, and governed it well, and Anne kept his household and raised their one son in the castles where she herself had been a girl. By the standards of her life, it was a settled and a stable time, a long pause in the turning of fortune's wheel, and there is reason to think she found in it a measure of contentment that had been absent before and would be absent after. She had come home, in a sense, to the north of her childhood, married now to the boy she had known in her father's household, raising a son in the familiar halls. It was not the grandeur her father had dreamed for her, but it may have been better than grandeur. A decade of relative peace and ordinary domestic life in a place she loved. That this quiet interval was the happiest part of her story tells us something about how hard the rest of it was. And it makes what came after all the more cruel. For the wheel had not finished with her, and the brief northern peace was only the stillness before the last and steepest fall. Anne's last illness and death have a particular poignancy, coming as they did at the very summit of the fortune her father had pursued. She had been queen for barely 2 years, and they had been years of grief rather than glory. The death of her only son, the boy she had raised at Middleham, struck her a blow from which she never recovered, and her own health, never robust, began to fail soon after. She wasted away through the winter, growing thinner and weaker, until she died in the early spring. Still a young woman, not yet 30. There is a detail that has come down to us, perhaps true and perhaps the malice of her enemies, that on the day she died the sky darkened in an eclipse, as though the heavens themselves marked the passing of the Kingmaker's daughter. Whether or not the sky truly darkened, the symbolism is apt, for with Anne's death, the last of Warwick's line of the body, the last of the two girls he had wagered so recklessly, went out of the world. Isabel was already 9 years dead. Now Anne followed her, and the two sisters who had grown up together at Warwick and Middleham were both gone, both before 30, both worn out and used up by the schemes of the men around them. Their father had reached for immortality through them, for a dynasty that would carry his blood down the centuries. Instead, his daughters died young and childless of surviving issue, or nearly so, and his line guttered out within a generation of his death. Anne, dying young and grieving in the spring of her brief queenship, was the last flicker of it. And when she died, the Kingmaker's direct line died with her, leaving only the doomed grandchildren and the long-suffering countess to carry the memory of what the family had been. The final destruction of everything the Kingmaker had built came only months after Anne's death, and it is worth following the story to its true end. Her husband, King Richard III, had taken the throne by setting aside his brother's sons, and his reign was short and troubled, shadowed by the disappearance of those boys, the princes in the Tower, and by the resentment of many who had served his brother. In the late summer of 1485, a challenger landed from across the sea, Henry Tudor, the last hope of the broken Lancastrian cause, with a thin claim and a small army and a great gamble. The two armies came together at Bosworth, in the heart of England, and there Richard fell abandoned by part of his force, hewn down in the thick of the fighting, the final English king ever to be killed in battle. At that, the House of York was swept from power, and the long Wars of the Roses came at last to their end. Richard was the husband of Warwick's daughter. His death was the final extinction of the Yorkist cause that the Kingmaker had done so much to raise. Everything Warwick had built, the kings he had made, the house he had served, the marriages he had arranged for his daughters, was now swept away, and a new dynasty, the Tudors, took the throne. The wheel that he had spun so masterfully in his lifetime turned one final time after his death and carried away the last of his works. He had made the House of York. The House of York was now destroyed, and his daughters, who had been wagered to secure its greatness, were dead, their marriages come to nothing, their father's whole life's work undone on a field at Bosworth, 14 years after he himself had fallen in the fog at Barnet. And what, through all of this, became of the mother, the Countess of Warwick? Robbed of her inheritance and declared a living corpse. Her fate is the strangest of all, for Anne Beauchamp outlived not only her husband, but both her daughters and very nearly everyone else in this story. She endured the years of her dispossession, stripped of the great fortune that was hers by right, living in obscurity and dependence while her sons-in-law enjoyed the wealth that the law had stolen from her. She saw both her daughters married to king's brothers, and both die young. Isabel at 25 and Anne at 28. She saw one son-in-law executed in the Tower and the other killed at Bosworth, and she lived on. When the Tudor dynasty came to power and swept away the House of York, the new king, for reasons of his own, restored to the aged countess a portion of the inheritance that had been taken from her, and she passed her final years with at least some of her rights acknowledged at last. She died in the autumn of 1492, an old woman of around 66. having outlived her husband by more than 20 years and both her children besides. The heiress whose blood had made the Kingmaker great, who had been robbed in the name of her own daughters and declared dead while she lived, proved in the end the great survivor of the whole tragedy, the last of them all to go. There is a bitter justice in it. The woman they had treated as already dead outlasted nearly every one of the men who had wronged her, and carried the memory of the whole catastrophe alone into the quiet of her old age. There is something quietly heartbreaking in the documents the Countess left from the years of her dispossession, for in them we hear, faintly, the voice of a real woman protesting a real injustice. When her husband fell and she fled to sanctuary, she wrote to the king, declaring herself his true and loyal subject, pleading for her safety and the restoration of her rights, setting out her case with the careful arguments of a woman who knew the law and knew that the law was on her side. It availed her nothing. The king's brothers wanted her lands, and the king let them have them, and her letters and her pleadings were simply ignored. But the letters survive, and through them we catch the human cost of all this high politics. A woman robbed of everything she owned, separated from her daughters, declared dead in law while she yet lived, reduced to writing letter after unanswered letter in defense of rights that no one with power had any intention of honoring. We are so often shown the men of these wars, the lords and the battles and the schemes, that it is easy to forget the human beings ground up in the machinery of it all. The Countess's letters are a reminder. Here was a woman who had committed no crime, who had been one of the great ladies of the kingdom, reduced to pleading in vain for the return of what was rightfully hers, while the men who had stolen it divided the spoils. That she survived it, that she outlived her robbers and recovered something at the end, is a kind of victory. But the years of dispossession were real, and the injustice was real, and the quiet, unanswered voice in those letters is one of the most human things in the whole hard story. What the Countess endured across those long years reveals a strength of character that the bare facts can obscure, and it is worth marking. She had been one of the great ladies of England, the wife of the mightiest subject in the land, mistress of vast estates and a magnificent household. And then, in the space of a single spring, she lost everything, her husband dead in battle and named a traitor, her property seized, her very legal existence denied, her daughters carried off into the keeping of grasping husbands. A lesser woman might have broken under it, or surrendered to despair, or faded quietly into obscurity. Anne Beauchamp did none of these things. She fought with the only weapons left to her, the patient weapons of the powerless. She wrote. She protested. She argued her case. She clung to the assertion of her rights, even when no one with power would hear them. And she endured, year after year, in dispossession and dependence, waiting out the long injustice with a resilience that finally, at the very end, was rewarded when the Tudor king restored to her a portion of what had been stolen. She outlived her robbers and recovered something of her own, and she did it not through power, which she had lost, but through sheer endurance. The refusal to disappear or to accept that the theft of her rights was final. There is a quiet heroism in it that deserves to be recognized. Among all the formidable figures of this story, the king-making father, the scheming brothers, the royal husbands, the Countess robbed and declared dead, and stripped of everything, may in the end have been the most resilient of them all. The one who took the worst that fortune could do and outlasted it. There is a terrible symmetry in the fates of the two sisters that is worth pausing over, for it gathers up the whole meaning of their story. Both Isabel and Anne were born to be the richest heiresses in England, raised in splendour as the precious girls of the mightiest subject in the land. Both were married off to royal dukes to serve their father's ambition. Both became the channels through which their mother's stolen inheritance flowed to grasping husbands. Both bore children who would suffer for the dangerous blood in their veins. And both died young. Isabel at 25, Anne at 28, worn out, used up their short lives, entirely shaped and ultimately consumed by the schemes of the men around them. Neither sister ever seems to have been asked what she wanted. Neither was ever permitted to be anything other than an instrument of someone else's ambition, first their father's and then their husband's. They were among the greatest heiresses of their age, and they had almost no power over their own lives. The vast wealth they carried, the royal marriages they made, the crown that came at last to one of them, none of it was for their benefit, and none of it brought them happiness. They were valuable, and being valuable in their world meant being used. The two girls who had grown up together in the nurseries of Warwick and Middleham, surrounded by more wealth than almost any children in England, were both in their graves before they were 30, having lived lives that belonged, from beginning to end, to other people. There is a final irony in Anne's crowning that should not be missed, for it brought to fulfilment, in the most hollow way imaginable, the very ambition for which her father had destroyed himself. The Earl had spent his life, and at last his life itself, in the pursuit of a crown to make kings, to bind his blood to the throne, to see a daughter of his stand as Queen of England. He had wagered Anne first on the Lancastrian side toward exactly that end, marrying her to a prince who might have made her queen had Tewkesbury gone the other way. He had died with the ambition unfulfilled, his gamble lost, his daughter a widow on the losing side, and then, years after his death, by a path he could never have foreseen, the thing he had reached for came to pass after all. His daughter Anne was crowned Queen of England, not as the wife of a Lancastrian prince, but as the wife of a Yorkist king, the very Richard of Gloucester who had grown up in Warwick's own household. The crown the Kingmaker had died reaching for descended, in the end upon his daughter's head, but he was 12 years in his grave and could not see it, and it brought Anne nothing but sorrow. A dead son and a wasting illness and an early grave of her own. The ambition was fulfilled and meant nothing. The Earl got his queen, and she was his daughter, and the getting of it was empty. For he was dead, and she was dying, and the crown sat on her head for barely 2 years before it passed away forever. It is the final mockery of all his scheming, that the great prize came to his blood at last, too late for him to see, and too bitter for her to enjoy. The brief queenship itself, when it came, was a strange and joyless thing, and it is worth picturing, for it was the destination toward which her father had steered her, reached at last by a road no one could have foreseen. Anne was crowned alongside her husband in a great ceremony, the daughter of the Kingmaker raised to the throne her father had died reaching for, robed and anointed and acknowledged as Queen of England. By every outward sign, it was the summit of fortune, and yet she came to it already half broken, the survivor of so much grief, and she would find in it almost no happiness at all. Within months, her only child was dead, the boy on whom the whole future had rested, and Anne, it is said, was never the same. After wasting visibly, withdrawing into sorrow, her health failing as her grief deepened. She moved through the ceremonies of queenship like a woman already half in shadow, the crown a weight rather than a glory. The great position her father had dreamed of for her, a thing of ashes in her hands. There is a terrible poignancy in it. This young woman, reaching the very height that had been the object of so much scheming and bloodshed, and finding there nothing but loss. The crown that had cost her father his life, that had cost her her girlhood and her first husband and her peace, brought her, when at last it came, only a brief and grieving reign and an early death. She was Queen of England, the daughter of the man who made kings, and she was one of the saddest figures ever to wear the crown, ascending to it broken and leaving it within 2 years for the grave. The ambition was fulfilled. It tasted of nothing but sorrow. For a long time, the two sisters were remembered, if at all, only as appendages to the men around them. Warwick's daughters, Clarence's wife, Gloucester's queen names in the family tree, pieces in the great game, with no story of their own. Only in recent times have historians set about recovering them as people, to ask what their lives were actually like, and to see them not merely as the instruments of others' ambitions, but as human beings who lived through extraordinary events. The recovery is difficult, for the records are thin and concerned almost entirely with the men and the money, leaving the inner lives of the women in shadow. We do not have their letters, their words, their thoughts. We have only the outline of what was done to them and around them. But even that outline, looked at clearly, reveals two human beings of real interest. Two sisters who shared an extraordinary childhood and were then carried, helpless, through war and exile and grief and sudden elevation, who lost children and husbands and finally their own young lives, all in the service of ambitions that were never their own. To recover Isabel and Anne as people rather than pawns is part of a broader effort to bring the women of these wars into focus. To acknowledge that the age was not shaped by its men alone, and that figures like Warwick's daughters, for all that they were denied any power over their own fates, were at the very heart of the story. They deserve to be remembered as more than the prizes in their father's game. They deserve to be remembered as themselves. It is striking how completely the women of this family have been overshadowed in the popular memory by the men and the battles, and how much is lost by that neglect. We remember Warwick the Kingmaker. We remember the kings he made and unmade. We remember Barnet and Tewkesbury and Bosworth. But the women, Anne Beauchamp the Countess, Isabel the Duchess, Anne the Queen, have tended to fade into the background. Names attached to the men, their own experiences passed over, and yet their stories, looked at clearly, are in some ways more affecting than the men's, for they suffered the consequences of the wars without ever having chosen the quarrels. Carried along helpless, through exile and grief, and sudden elevation by forces entirely beyond their control. The Countess robbed of her inheritance, and declared legally dead, Isabel losing her baby in a storm and dying worn out at 25. Anne staked first on Lancaster and then on York, widowed at 15, crowned and bereaved and dead before 30. These are human tragedies of a particular and poignant kind, the tragedies of people used as instruments and then discarded. To remember the family rightly is to remember not only the mighty father, but the women whose lives his ambition shaped and ended. To grant them the dignity of being protagonists in their own right. They were not merely the Kingmaker's women. They were people who lived and suffered and died in the great catastrophe of their age, and they deserve to be remembered as fully as the man whose name has eclipsed them all. And what of the man who began it all? The father who raised them like treasure and spent them like coin. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, was in his way the most powerful subject England has ever produced. A man who truly held the destiny of the crown within his grasp, who made one king and unmade him and made another, who ruled the kingdom and commanded its armies and dispensed its wealth as though he were a prince in his own right. And yet for all his power, he failed at the one thing he most wanted, which was to found a great dynasty of his own and bind his blood to the throne forever. He had no son. He had only his 2 girls, and he poured into them all his dynastic hopes, marrying them to princes, wagering them on the great gamble for the crown, and the gamble destroyed him. And the daughters he had used so coldly outlived him only briefly before they too were used up and cast aside. Everything he built came to nothing. His vast inheritance was carved up by other men. His daughters died young. His grandchildren were imprisoned and executed for the dangerous blood he had given them, and within a generation his line was effectively extinct. The man who made kings could not, in the end, secure the future of his own family. He reached for everything and grasped, for a moment, very nearly all of it. And then it slipped through his fingers on a foggy morning at Barnet, and the dynasty he had dreamed of died with his daughters before the century was out. He had spent his children to build a house that did not outlast them. It is the oldest lesson in the world, and the Kingmaker, for all his cunning, never learned it, that the people we treat as instruments of our ambition are not instruments at all, but the only thing that truly matters, and the only legacy that ever really lasts. Historians have long argued over how to judge Warwick, and the debate touches one of the great questions of his age. To some, he is the very type of the overmighty subject, the magnate grown so rich and so powerful that he threatened the crown itself, the embodiment of everything that was wrong with a system in which a single nobleman could raise armies, command the loyalty of thousands, and make or unmake kings at will. In this view, the wars themselves were in large part the product of men like Warwick, of a nobility grown too strong for the crown to control, and the strong new monarchy that eventually tamed them was a necessary correction. To others, Warwick is a more sympathetic figure, a genuinely able man driven to rebellion by a king's ingratitude and the rise of grasping rivals, a great servant of the state, cast aside and forced to fight for his rightful place. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere between, and shifts depending on where one stands. What is beyond dispute is that the Earl represents, more completely than any other single figure, the dangerous overgrowth of noble power that marked his age, the system, sometimes called bastard feudalism, in which lords bound great followings to themselves by wages and livery, and could turn those followings against the crown. He was the greatest practitioner of that system, and in the end, one of its greatest victims, destroyed by the very forces he had ridden so high. Whether one judges him a noble wronged or an overreacher justly fallen, he stands as the supreme example of what it meant for good and ill to be an overmighty subject in the age of the Wars of the Roses. At the root of Warwick's whole tragedy lay a single biological fact, simple and inescapable. He had no son. For all his wealth and power, for all his armies and his cunning and his vast estates, he could not produce the one thing a great dynastic design required above all else: a male heir to carry his name and his blood and his fortune into the next generation. He had 2 daughters and no son, and in the harsh logic of his world, that meant his line in the male would end with him. A son would have inherited the Neville name and the Warwick title and carried the family forward. Daughters, however rich, married into different families and bore their children under different names. This is why the Earl poured such ferocious ambition into his girls' marriages, why he wagered them so recklessly on the throne, because they were all he had, the only vessels through which his blood might reach greatness, the only pieces on the board that bore his colours. Had he fathered a son, the story might have run differently. He might have built his dynasty in the ordinary way, through a male heir, and not staked everything on the desperate marriages of his girls. But he had no son. And so his girls carried the whole weight of his dynastic hopes. And when those hopes failed, and the daughters died young, there was nothing left, no son to carry on, no line to continue. Only the dangerous blood passing to a handful of grandchildren who would be destroyed for carrying it. The Kingmaker's failure to father a son was the quiet flaw at the centre of all his greatness, the reason he had to spend his girls so ruthlessly, and the reason that, when they were gone, his house was simply finished. When we stand back and survey all of it, the Kingmaker, his countess, his 2 girls, his doomed grandchildren, what emerges is one of the most complete family tragedies in all of English history. A house that rose higher than almost any subject family ever rose, and then was annihilated utterly, root and branch, within the span of a few decades. Consider the reckoning. The father, the mightiest subject in England, killed in battle against the king he had made. The two daughters, the richest heiresses in the kingdom, both dead before 30, worn out and used up in the service of others' ambitions. The countess, robbed of her inheritance and declared legally dead while she lived. One son-in-law executed in the Tower by his own brother, the other killed at Bosworth, the last king of his house. The grandchildren imprisoned and, in the end, executed for the dangerous blood in their veins. Within 2 generations of the Kingmaker's greatest triumphs, his line was effectively extinct, his name extinguished, his vast inheritance scattered, his every dynastic hope brought to nothing. Few families in history have risen so high and fallen so completely, and fewer still have been so thoroughly destroyed by the very wealth and blood and ambition that raised them. The House of Warwick is a kind of parable of its violent age, a demonstration of how the reaching for power could consume utterly those who reached, of how the greatest prizes could become the deadliest curses. The Kingmaker played the Game of Thrones more boldly and more brilliantly than anyone of his time, and the game destroyed him and everyone he loved. It is a story without a single happy ending in it, a long descent from the summit of fortune into the grave, and it stands as one of the bleakest and most complete tragedies that the Wars of the Roses, an age rich in tragedy, ever produced. It is worth holding, at the last, the sheer strangeness of the road these lives travelled, for there can be few family stories quite so improbable. A boy is married to a girl for the inheritance she might bring, and a chain of deaths makes him, almost by accident, the richest subject in England. He uses that wealth to make a king, and then to unmake him, and then to make another. He marries one daughter to a Yorkist prince and the other to a Lancastrian one, wagering his children on both sides of the same war. He kneels for an hour before the enemy he spent his life destroying, trades his 14-year-old daughter for an army, and rules England through a mad old king he has taken out of prison. He dies in a fog on an Easter morning, betrayed by his own son-in-law. His widow is declared legally dead so that her daughter's husbands can steal her lands. One daughter loses her baby in a storm at sea and dies worn out at 25. The other is widowed at 15, hidden as a servant, fought over by 2 royal brothers, and finally crowned queen only to die grieving and young. The grandchildren are imprisoned and executed for their blood, and the old countess, robbed and declared dead, outlives them all. It reads like an invention, a tale too strange and too cruel to be true, and yet every part of it is sober history. The recorded fate of one real family caught in the great catastrophe of its age. The Wars of the Roses produced many tragedies, but few with so many strange turns, so many reversals of fortune, so complete a descent from the heights to the grave. The story of the Kingmaker and his daughters is among the strangest and the saddest the long quarrel ever told. And there is a larger meaning in it too, beyond the fate of a single family. For the story of the Kingmaker and his daughters stands as a kind of summation of its whole violent age. Everything that the Wars of the Roses were is gathered up in it. The overgrown power of the nobility, the making and unmaking of kings, the shifting and treacherous alliances, the marriages used as weapons, the women wagered and the men slaughtered, the families destroying themselves and one another in the endless reaching for the crown. To follow this one family through its rise and ruin is to see the whole age in miniature, its glory and its cruelty, its grandeur and its waste. The Kingmaker was the supreme example of the overmighty subject whose power the wars both created and consumed. His daughters were the supreme examples of the heiresses spent as currency in the dynastic game. The whole arc of the family, from the heights of fortune to total extinction, was the arc of the age itself, which raised great houses up and tore them down with terrible indifference. When at last the wars ended and a new and stronger monarchy rose from the wreckage, it rose in part because families like Warwick's had bled one another white, until the survivors were too exhausted and too few to resist a crown that meant to master them. The Kingmaker and his daughters were among the casualties of that long self-destruction, and what befell them is, in the end, the story of the age that made and unmade them, an age of glittering ambition and bottomless cruelty, of fortunes won and lost in an afternoon, of children spent for crowns that turned to ash. It is worth remembering all of this, not only for itself, but for what it shows us of a whole world, now 5 centuries gone, that lived and died by the making and the breaking of kings. Before we let them go, hold in your mind one last image, not of the battlefield, not of the fog, but of the 2 little girls in the warm upper chambers of Warwick Castle, long before any of it, in the years when they were simply daughters of a great house, precious and protected, with the whole of their unwritten lives still before them. Picture Isabel and Anne as children, in the firelight of those vanished rooms, not yet pieces on anyone's board, not yet duchess or queen or widow, not yet wagered or spent, only 2 sisters growing up together in the heart of all that wealth, with their father, the most powerful man in England, somewhere out in the wide world, making and unmaking kings. That is where the night should leave them, in the warmth and the firelight, before the storms came and the fog rolled in, when they were only children, and the future was still nothing but a story that had not yet been told. If these slow journeys into the far past are something you would like to take again, you are always welcome to subscribe. And another quiet evening, like this one, will be waiting whenever you have need of it. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.